Welcome everyone to the September 17th meeting of the Housing and Community Development Committee. I'm calling the meeting to order and we have a quorum. So our first item of business is public comment, and we have two people signed up. Tina Payden, you're first, and public comments for 3 minutes.
Hi, good evening, Tina Payden. While we're considering Envision 2045, I hope that we can envision some help and more support for the small landlords. This committee and city council and everyone claims to be concerned about affordable housing, while landlords like me are the ones providing the affordable housing, but we can't get the help. I continue to see and have been at various meetings in the last couple of months. Unfortunately, many of the times I'm the only Black person in the room. So what you're setting up for your downtown Evanston is not for minorities, is not for low income, and it's not for families. Because what is being approved is studios that start at $1,800. And most of these tall buildings, which I was at the meeting, and they discussed a 2-bedroom starting at $3,400. That's not for a family. That's not for low income. And that's not for minorities. So while you're saying yes, yes, yes to tall buildings, remember what you're saying in Envision 2045, or how about 2025? When you're claiming to be concerned about preserving affordable housing, while I continuously get ignored and try to provide with vouchers and low-income property. Soon, landlords like myself would disappear because we can't compete. We don't get the support, and we'll go away, and then what you're claiming to be affordable housing will no longer exist. And families will no longer exist in Evanston, and minorities will no longer exist in Evanston. Also, you need to re-examine the AMI, which is 60%. Most of the buildings that I go to the meetings, 100 units, and only 8 affordable at 60% AMI, when HUD is 30% AMI. So you're encouraging the developers to exclude HUD development. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Tricia Connolly.
Good evening, Chair Ravel, the Housing and Community Development Committee, and Ms. Williams. I'm here tonight to share a statement from the Community Alliance for Better Government, also known as CABG. We realize you have a full agenda tonight, which does not include the Wesley buildings. Thank you for replying to our email reminding the committee to schedule a public hearing as soon as possible to get to the bottom of how it was that the city allowed the 3 adjacent Wesley low-income rental residences to fall through the cracks of its oversight processes. We cannot emphasize the underlying reason for the importance of this internal review. They are promoting the well-being of the residents who lived in the 24 units that composed 2014, 2018, and 2024 Wesley, all of whom who had low incomes and were members of a legally protected class. Following through on Evanston's commitment to HUD, one of its most important funders, when it pledged to use CDBG funds to inspect multifamily buildings in the CDBG target areas every 3 years instead of every 5 years, with the understanding that, in fact, these are the areas most in need of city to help preservation. Uncovering where the lack of communication occurred between city staff and departments. Accounting for all the expenses related to vacating the Wesley buildings so that the public can understand how this compares to what it would have cost to have maintained the 3-year inspection cycle and actively overseen landlord maintenance and rehab. Promoting transparency in the view of the public and tenants, and finally ensuring that this will never happen again to anyone anywhere. This issue was first revealed to tenants and the public in February. In June, following Gail Schechter's presentation and resident calls for public hearing, it is now September, and we can't wait any longer. The public expects the city to follow through. In a daily NU article from June 24th, it was reported that the committee acknowledged the need to formally address these issues on the agenda, with Rodriguez emphasizing the urgency for the city to take action. The meeting concluded with a commitment to include these matters on the agenda for further discussions. Residents say they're glad to hear that the Wesley buildings will be discussed in future agendas. We are making a final plea to this committee that a public hearing for these buildings be placed on an October HCDC agenda. If not, we will be making a formal and public request of the full city council to address this issue. We look forward to hearing from you about a public hearing date and stand ready to publicize this to the general public. Thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you. So we have scheduled a special meeting in early November for a discussion about our building standard inspection process. And so there'll be more formal information about that soon. Yeah, Ugo.
Thank you, Chair Ravel. Would that discussion include the Wesley buildings as Ms. Connolly is requesting? And I remember that this committee made the commitment to the residents of the Wesley apartments as well as to the community at large to have that special meeting to address the particular issues that happened with those buildings, as well as perhaps other buildings that might be in similar situations that we don't know about. This committee learned about it just by showing up of the residents of the building to our committee requesting our help. So are we including that and giving a good portion of our time during that early November special meeting?
I mean, I think the focus of the meeting is to look at our overall inspection program and to see where it should have been better in the past, but how we're working to improve it going forward.
I think that analyzing what happened, sorry to interrupt, sorry.
And it's not going to be a hearing, it's going to be a discussion among, with staff about the program and among us about how we can make sure that it works more effectively going forward.
But I think that discussing what happened with the Wesley buildings will be an incredibly educational opportunity for the committee as well as for the city to make sure that that doesn't repeat itself in the future at any point. And we still would like to know what's going to be the design for those 3 buildings, what is the intention of the city to turn them into, if the city is in control of that, and if not, what's happening as of now with those 3 buildings.
Yeah, well, my understanding is we don't really know yet what's happening with the buildings.
When will we know?
I don't know.
Can we have maybe an update of what's going on to today?
Good evening, members of the Housing and Community Development Committee, Liz Williams. We will provide an update at the special meeting in terms of the status of where things are at. I don't have an answer for you specifically this evening. Thank you.
Okay. So let's move on to our very full agenda for this evening. The first item of business is approval of the minutes of our July 16th meeting. Could I have a motion? Whoops. Oh, I'm sorry. I can't see all these lights.
No worries. So one
Please
thing I just
start.
want to remind everyone, and I shared this with one of the people from CBG leadership group. There are legal proceedings which provide a lot of uncertainty as to what's happening with the properties, and I think a lot of the specifics of what's going on would be better discussed after that's done. And I have no idea when that is going to happen, and also the city is not involved in that lawsuit. So, but I think it'd be prudent to wait to really dive in until after that.
Right. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. Yeah. Okay, could I have a motion to approve of the minutes of our July 16th meeting? Someone? A motion?
Move approval of the minutes.
Thank you. In a second?
Second.
Okay. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed, no?
I abstain.
Okay. Oh,
Was
yes,
not at the
yes,
meeting,
right,
sorry.
Yes, thank you. Okay. Okay, great. Okay. And then our next more substantive item of business is to approve a $250,000 expenditure of home funding for the TBRA program. So could we have a motion so we can begin discussing that?
I move approval of item A, approval of $250,000 of home investment partnerships funding for the tenant-based rental assistance program.
Okay, and a second? Second. Great, thank you. Staff, Anna.
Hello. Ana Elizarraga, Housing and Economic Development Analyst. We have an application for renewal for the tenant-based rental assistance program. This is HUD funded with home investment partnership funds, and they're requesting $250,000. This is specifically to provide stable housing and supportive services to for 24 months for low-income, at-risk families with children under 18 in District 65 or in Evanston schools. The last cohort ran from June 1st, 2022 to June 30th, 2024. And during that time, the TBRA program provided service and housing to 18 Evanston families, including 22 adults and 38 children. The average monthly assistance per household is $1,500, and the average family size is of 4 people. Since 2020, 85% of the families have been able to sustain housing costs on their own after graduating from the program. And 100% of them were enrolled in case management and supportive services, including financial coaching, life skills, workforce development, mental health care services, and benefit enrollment. All families served have maintained or increased their income while in the program. This was last brought to the Housing and Community Development Committee for $200,000 back in May 9th of 2022, and it was approved back then. So this is our renewal for new families to be brought into a new cohort.
Great, thank you. Any questions or comments from the committee?
And we have Jennifer Crystal from Connections for the
Okay.
Homeless here to answer any questions from the committee.
Okay, great. Chloe?
Thanks.
Hey, everyone.
Hi. Thank you. And this is really helpful to learn more context. I just was curious. The success rates really seems great, and I was just wondering how you define sustained housing costs. I'm not entirely familiar with the program, so what does that mean exactly for families? And then the other question that I had was just, do you have evaluations from the participants too, or? plans to do that?
Like satisfaction?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I can talk through both
Great.
of those.
Wonderful.
And I'm Jen Foyer-Crystal. I'm the Senior Director of Housing and Youth Programs at Connections for the Homeless. And I've been overseeing the TIBA program for about 8 years and, seen it through COVID. And so a lot has changed in good and bad ways, in especially the housing cost. So your first question, so how we define success in TIBRA is that somebody's able to, when they're done with the funding, when a family's funding ends, which usually lasts 24 months, but we do recertify at 12 months. Sometimes they can be over 80% AMI and then they're no longer eligible. And there can, other times, very rarely, we will exit a family after 12 months, but generally the program is 24 months for everyone. And we define success that they're able to either maintain or increase income, hopefully increase, and then be able to stay in Evanston after the program. And it's gotten harder and harder over the years because the housing costs, we're seeing 2 bedrooms running about $2,000 right now. And so that's gotten harder and harder. And we're also, we serve, even though people are employable and they can get a lease in their own name, people can have barriers and challenges that show up when they're in the program. So that's why we do a lot of more, cohesive case management beyond just rental assistance. And then your second question about, so we do annual satisfaction surveys. Every June we do, an online, and also we'll print it out for people and we have it available in Spanish as well. And we also have ways to give feedback throughout the year. So we really value that feedback. And when we get it, we make changes based on the feedback. And we generally get, about 15% back. So we don't get a ton of feedback, but when we get it, we take it very seriously. Yeah. Does that answer both your questions?
I was curious a bit about just the kinds of feedback you receive and how you sort of incorporate that.
Sure. So we ask, I think it's 6 questions about, do you feel safe with your case manager? Do you feel like you would refer a friend for the program? We ask about health outcomes, like do you feel healthier and more well being housed? And generally, we get really good feedback on all of those things. And then we give plenty of room for people to give, verbal narrative around how they're feeling. This year we got feedback, and we do it for all the housing programs. So I'm not specifying TIBR feedback. I just want to be transparent about that. But we've gotten feedback about wanting more social events. That's been something that's come up a lot in our participant advisory board that Sue helps facilitate as well. And so that's coming up a lot. And we're trying to up the ante again pre-COVID, where we're getting together and doing things because we used to do a lot of outings. And then, we'll get specific feedback about a case manager as well, sometimes mostly good. And if there is any concern, we follow up immediately. So there weren't a ton of trends, but the one trend was wanting more social stuff. Thanks. Yeah. That's really helpful. Thank you. Thanks for your question.
Yeah. Ugo, you're next.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions also, Ms. Crystal. As you mentioned earlier during your initial comments, housing costs in Evanston are going through the roof, and a 2-bedroom average is $2,000, if not more, and it's growing almost daily, especially with the new algorithms that are being used in some of the buildings. So I think that is going to be the trend that is not going to stop. Given that, do you have Connections for the Homeless has plans for future increases on the rent aid to the recipients of your program? And 2 is, this is through personal experience, not personal me, but I have witnessed that some recipients of aid that is also transitional aid to help them get to a better place on their own at one point or another, have issues with getting to that 80%, but 80% is not enough for a living.
It's not.
So are you having any provisions to go above that, or are we capped at 80%? And if you reach 80%, and 2 instances to what could happen with that 80% is that some people will do anything they can to not get to that 80% because it's not sufficient to sustain their families. So there is a stalling on the end of the recipient, or two is that it might be that 80% or 85% is all they can get given their skills, their abilities to work or earn on their own. So are there any provisions within the programs to take some action with those two instances?
These are such great questions. Very thoughtful. Thank you. So the first thing, so we do use the HUD small market rent amounts. So every year HUD publishes.
What is the call? What is it called?
So I'll explain. So small market rent. So
Okay.
they publish fair market rents, which if you look in the Chicago, we're part of the Chicagoland fair market rents, they're very, very low. And then they publish small market rents, which match more what the smaller market, the zip codes, what the rents, like the median rents are in the zip codes. We're lucky enough to work with the team here. We can use the small market rent. So yes, your question, the first question is that we are upping what we will contribute, of course, to rent, because we can't look at, if what somebody's allowed to pay for a 2-bedroom is $1,400, and in Evanston we're seeing $1,800 and $2,000, we would never be able to support a family to actually find housing in Evanston. So yeah, we are increasing throughout. Your question about do people try to stay under the 80%? I have not seen that happen. In fact, we've only had, I think, 2 families since I started that went over the 80% while they're in. So I think you are absolutely right that sometimes people cap out where they can, what income they can increase in their household. One of the big parts of TBRA is that we are very focused on building skill. And so we have a family that's been in TBRA since February. Mom was in nursing school and she actually just finished, and she's now looking for a job. Now she's a single mom, and if she had not been in TBRA, she would not be able to finish school and afford her rent, because she was at the time at risk of homelessness. And she probably would have had to leave school. So sometimes the program can serve a purpose where people get support while they need it. And then she could increase her income above 80% AMI with some nursing jobs. And then she'll graduate, and that's a good thing. So we always, we're in constant conversation about financial literacy. And, if we thought somebody wasn't taking an opportunity because they don't want to go over the 80%, we really walk through, the calculations of how rent would be calculated, that we would probably be paying a really small portion at that point anyways, and do a lot of financial literacy and budgeting around that. But a big part of TBRA is that building skills so you can increase your income. And because it's 2 years, it can give some time for people to do that. Sometimes there's 6-month programs for a specific skill that can then get them a more stable job. And then sometimes they are in like a longer term goal, like a nursing program.
Do you mind if I ask you a follow-up question to that? And it is that pretty much across the board, every landlord is asking that your earnings are 3 times what the rent is, which then signifies that if we're paying the average, which, by the way, will not be downtown, as Ms. Payton mentioned earlier, in Evanston at least. So say somebody is at $18,000 or $2,000 per month, that means that their income, the family income, has to be at least $6,000, which, in terms is $72,000 a year. Not every family can earn that. Hence, not every family can qualify for that average 2-bedroom apartment in the city of Evanston. So is there anything within the program that you represent here to address that and to aid maybe, I don't know, anything that could satisfy a landlord and say, all right, we'll take your $2,000 even though you earn less than what we are requiring everybody to do, because you have the backup of HUD, Connections for the Homeless, whatever it is. Is there anything like that within your program?
Absolutely.
Great.
So I don't know if everyone's heard of source of income discrimination. So this TBRA funding, if they discriminate against a household that has this funding, they can be sued based on source of income discrimination. So because it's a short-term subsidy, their household income only has to be the part of rent portion they're going to pay. So if there's 0 rent, we're paying 100% of the rent. They cannot use the triple the rent to discriminate against them getting that unit, because we're going to pay 100% of the rent. If their income is, I'm just going to say 600 a month because I'm a social worker, not a mathematician. So if their rent's 200, they would have to show the landlord that they have 600 because they're responsible for 30% of their income towards the rent. And we've actually worked with open communities recently on 2 different cases to put this into play where landlords didn't realize that. And we had open communities write a letter to say, no, actually short-term funding, 2-year funding is, you cannot discriminate against source of income, just like if it was a housing authority voucher. And so we've had a lot of success with this recently.
And I think that most responsible and caring landlords act under that scenario that you just painted. But my concern is more not while they're within the program, but what happens when they are responsible for the $2,000 after the 2 years that they're with your program, and then they don't have it because they have been earning, I don't want to go down to the $600, but let's say they're now earning $3,000 a month. That would only qualify them on their free market for $1,000 rent, which that means they cannot live in Evanston anymore if they need 2 bedrooms.
Yeah, and that's a real struggle.
It is a real struggle.
Sometimes we've had some success where people they have such a good relationship with their landlord by the end of the program. Their landlord's like, all right, you paid your portion,
Awesome.
You can stay. That happens. Those are the successes where we're like, yes, because this landlord saw that this person was going to be responsible for their rent. But yeah, we see that a lot. And we have had some households that had to move out of Evanston because it was cost prohibitive to stay here. But that's our goal in the program, is to try to give them the best chance to be able to stay here after the funding. So does that answer all that question?
Mine it does. Thank you.
Okay, sure.
Councilmember Heracars.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in and just also say how impressed I was with the success rate, 85%. That's really impressive for, the difficult job of, helping people stay housed here in Evanston when they're struggling. One thing I had a question about was the wait list and how people, because you mentioned in the report that there's, folks that sometimes roll off based on their positions improving. What kind of a wait list is there? And I also saw, I was pleased to see that we have contacts with District 65 and 202 social workers to, work, to, get struggling families to get the help they need. Can you just explain kind of a little bit like this current wait list situation and how folks tend to find out about the program and that process?
Absolutely. Yeah, great question. So we try not to keep a wait list where somebody's sitting on it because it's such a small amount. Every time we get a grant, it's about 8 to 12 households we can serve at a time. And so because we're lucky enough to be at an agency that has different sources of funding, we're always trying to get somebody to something quicker. So we never are like, okay, you're 10th on the wait list or you're 9th on the wait list, but we do move through. So we keep what we call a TBRA eligible list. So it's families that have kids in District 65 or 202 that we know are housing insecure or experiencing homelessness. And we're just in contact with them from the beginning of referral. And sometimes they're going through other services at Connections. If somebody's actually like sleeping in their car, we're going to have them go to drop-in so they can get housed in quicker than waiting on a TBRA wait list, right? Right now, I just checked with the team this morning. Right now, we have about 5 families that we're actively engaging with. And then we meet monthly with Lori, and sometimes Allie Harned also joins from District 65. And they don't wait for the monthly meeting, but they're regularly referring people over that we're screening. And if they're not eligible to go to something else at Connections, like maybe they just need security deposit first month's rent, we're going to send them to prevention. So people that purely TBRA is like kind of the program for them, then we're consulting every month to prioritize, based on who's in a more vital situation and needs to be kind of prioritized with TBRA. And also we don't want to put somebody in a bad situation where, they have 3 recent evictions in the past 5 years. They're going to have a really hard time finding a landlord. We might try to find them a different program within Connections that'll work. So it's this very, dramatic process where we're really trying, I don't know if that's the right word, but we're really trying to find the right spot for each family that comes our way. So I would say in a month, we're getting about 10 referrals of families. And then, a handful are kind of staying in the TBRA kind of mindset to figure out when we can serve them. So we're really excited for this funding because we have, the team said that after we know we're getting it, we can start processing the 5 families we have kind of ready, and then also be consulting with the district and with Family Promise and the YW. We work with all the partners throughout Evanston to see who needs this. So it's a very dynamic process.
Thank you.
That was long-winded.
No,
Hopefully
that
answered.
was great.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And I would say one measure of success also is how the kids are doing in school. And that's, I think you've told us in the past about, the kids are in school, they're doing well, and how, that's why this group of participants is so important.
Yes. Oh, there's so much research to show that moving schools, how it sets you back every time. And especially moving out of a zip code is, research shows how that can have effects throughout somebody's lifespan. So yeah, we do a lot of focus on children. We recently took 8 of our kiddos to a 6-day sleepaway camp, a YM sleepaway camp in Indiana, so they can thrive. So it's not just about surviving when you're in this program. We really are trying to help the kids thrive. We help pay for day camp in the summer, extracurriculars, and we really want to make sure the kids are feeling, the love as well. It's not just about rental assistance.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was interested in knowing how many of the families managed to stay in the apartment that they've been in for the 2 years of the TBRA program. So that's kind of, it's rare, is it, that they?
I don't have an exact number.
Sure.
I'm sorry. But I know that we have that happen with every cohort. We'll have a couple families that have built
right.
that rapport with the landlord that Mr. Rodriguez was asking about, and they're able to stay with that landlord.
Yeah.
So
right.
it's
Yeah.
not all the time, but
Sure.
we try to, that's our first solution usually, is let's try to stay here.
Right. Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're ready to vote. Do we need to do a roll call? Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Chair Ravel,
Aye.
Councilmember Heracariz,
Aye.
Hugo Rodriguez,
Aye.
Fran Sweeney,
Aye.
and Chloe Thurston.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Great. Thank you. Now our next couple of items, I think, are discussion only. And first is the strategic housing plan. Uri, you want to walk us through the 14 or so questions we have to give you feedback on?
Chair Ravel, do we have to
Oh,
move it for discussion?
Beg your pardon?
Do we have to move this for discussion?
Sure, go,
I
please.
guess. I will move item B, Evanston Housing for All Strategic Plan, Housing Plan Draft Framework for discussion.
Okay, and a second? Okay, thank you. All right, take it away.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Uri Pachter, Senior Housing Planner, Chair Ravel, and committee members. I'm happy to be back after we started our discussion on a very high level in June. And we're here today to dig into a draft framework that has a lot more detail, but still stays at a level where there's not a ton of prose. There's mostly bullet points and facts and sections, so that hopefully it's a little bit easier, even though it's a long document, to see what could be missing, what needs to be reprioritized, what seems important to double down on. That's the type of feedback that would be really helpful as we take this to the next step, where we're planning on coming back next month to discuss the full plan, so that it can go to council and be approved in this calendar year. So let me see. This usually doesn't work once I get up here. So just as a reminder, this is a city council goal to approve a strategic housing plan in 2024. Specifically, we are looking to develop an actionable housing strategy. And there's a lot of other benefits that can come out of this as well, including funding opportunities and additional partnerships. So as I mentioned, we were here in June, and there's been some feedback opportunities previously. There'll be additional feedback opportunities on this draft framework plan outside of HCDC for community members and housing adjacent organizations to continue providing feedback, so we can take that into account for the final plan. As a reminder, this is the general outline of the plan, the 3 sections that have been highlighted in, let's call that rose or pink, the first one and the last 2 have not been included in this draft framework plan. They really are critical, but also rely on having finalized the other aspects. And so instead of going through the motions, we're trying to hone in on the middle pieces, and then it'll be clearer once we have clear priorities, where the implementation pieces and metrics are. Same thing with the beginning portion on the summary as well. Hard to summarize when we haven't finalized. So I'm going to walk through at a relatively high level the different aspects of the plan. You have that attached in the packet. There will be probably more information on the slides than I speak to, and there's a lot more information in the document, but I want to try to balance that piece. And I think there may be 13 questions that Chair Revelle mentioned, trying to just give various opportunities for how to think about this. I did break it down into sort of priority questions. The additional questions are still great feedback to receive. The priority ones are just a little bit more high level about objectives and goals, and the other aspects sort of follow from that. So the introduction composes 3 parts. The first is housing history, and the goal is really having a succinct summary of Evanston and national housing history, really leaning on other work that's been done and not trying to reinvent the wheel. We're also focused on the future and less so on the past, in terms of where we're going to dedicate more resources, but really focusing a lot on segregation, inequality, fair housing, affordability, et cetera. And there's a few different sections that references in the draft plan framework various resources that we're looking to rely on. At the purpose of the plan, these bullet points we went over for discussion last time as well, but just as a reminder, assessing housing needs, establishing objectives and SMART goals, describing current and potential policies and programs, identifying resources, and developing an implementation plan with metrics to monitor progress. And then below you can see, just as some examples, other aspects, city council goals, important elements of the community have a plan within the city for an actionable strategy. And we're seeing Housing for All, this strategic housing plan, playing that similar role. That's has been helpful in talking to folks where this can live, what role it can play. So far, we've received over 110 responses from community members when we were discussing the very beginning ideas of what the strategic housing plan could look like. We've made modifications to our original direction in a variety of ways, and a few of them include really doubling down on affordability and cost burden, expanding our objectives, and acknowledging the variety of current challenges. Also, an all of the above approach with a focus on specific populations. We heard there's a lot of need, but don't focus specifically only on a couple populations. It needs to be everyone, which is difficult to do, but we're up for it. And a lot of additional organizations and resources as well. As I mentioned before, the draft framework that's before you today will be available to the community through a similar digital feedback process. Hopefully we'll get similar amounts of feedback and be able to adjust based on both HCDC and the public's direction to have an even better plan for you next month. So the portion of the plan that has the most detail is the housing needs, where there's lots and lots of data and charts. I've pulled a few highlights for each section here, and I'm not going to go through every one of them, but a couple things to keep in mind. One, for all these sections, generally we're comparing data from about 10 years ago, from comparing 2022 data, which is the newest data from the census, with 2012 data. There are a variety of other ways that we could end up doubling down and looking deeper if there's one particular area that seems like another way of looking at it could be particularly interesting. We wanted to keep it standardized, though, across all the different elements. So for demographics, We've seen a chunk more residents, particularly 65 and older. That area has seen a very significant increase over the last 10 years. Smaller households, and just some interesting other notes on the prominence of populations that some might see as a smaller portion of the community, but are a meaningful portion of Evanston's community. In terms of housing stock or how households are renting or owning, it's close to 50-50, but more residents own in Evanston. And in the last 10 years, the growth in households has been pretty similar, of renter households and owner households. And close to 50%, a little 42% of homes in Evanston were built before 1940. And then in each sort of approximately 40-year period after that, it's gone down a little bit. And so we have an opportunity to speak to that as well in the plan. And then the next two slides are about affordability. The first one focused on rental affordability and the next one on for sale. As you can see, there's been some pretty substantial changes in rental affordability. The first two bullet points, many people, the majority of people who are paying less than $1,000 a month in rent are paying more than that now. And there used to be a lot fewer folks who are paying less than $1,500, and that has dramatically increased. As you can see, median rent has increased as well, and the number of households that are cost burdened, which is spending 30% or more on housing, or severely cost burdened, the same thing, but 50%, are very substantial. I put the numbers up rather than percentages because I think it's important just to note, even if the percentage is low, that's a lot of households that are struggling and spending too much on housing. And then in terms of for sale affordability, I distinguish between households that have a mortgage and that don't have a mortgage because I noticed a pretty substantial difference in the data. And as you can see from this, that about a third of households that own without a mortgage are spending $1,500 or more on housing. And if you have a mortgage, almost 90% are spending $1,500 or more on housing, which does, they're not one-to-one correlation, but as the community gets older and households may have been in their home for longer and no longer have a mortgage, becomes more affordable, but not necessarily to the person who purchases it afterwards, who's likely going to have to take out a mortgage. As you can see, moving forward on these slides, I think there were 6 priority questions I've listed here, just as a reminder as to sort of generally speaking what they're relating to, but I'll have them listed at the end as well, just so you can sort of start thinking about it. So the first one would be, I know that's a lot of data, and we want to make this data-driven. So are there pieces that would be important to include that we haven't included that would be great to use so that we can base our actions off of those additional data? So moving on to objectives. And so the terminology in the plan that we've laid out is objectives are sort of the highest category, the areas where we're striving for. Goals are specific, actionable, SMART goals over a 10-year period. How many new housing units are we going to build over that period of time? And that will help us achieve those objectives. And then policies are helping us to achieve those goals. So the first one is those objectives. As you can see, we initially had fewer number of objectives, and through input, it seemed they were too limited, and we needed to expand to be a little bit more specific about the areas of need. So fairness, safety, and stability, healthy, attainable, accessible, and connected, and create and preserve. The last two are more action-oriented, but ways that we need to move to address some of the other components. And again, a question is, are these objectives encompassing our housing challenges? Is there something missing? Is there a better way to articulate this? And another element of sort of the objectives and the high-level pieces, who are we talking about? As a reminder, this isn't a plan about affordable housing only. It's not market rate housing, it's sustainability, it's fair housing, it's all the components of housing. So it also includes everyone in Evanston, and these were, we had a lot more specific categories that we've identified and that community members identified. We tried to boil them down into still a long list, but that was a little bit more cohesive. The question still remains, do these populations encompass the diverse community in Evanston? Are we missing? Are there gaps? Are there better ways to make sure no one's slipping through the cracks as we're being strategic over the next 10 years? There's going to be a test on the following chart in a few minutes, so make sure that you are prepared. I show this here more just as an example. I'm not going to go over the whole thing on the next one, but SMART goals, as a reminder, are specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and time-bound. These are an example of some that we've come up with. If you look at the chart on the left, they're a data point that we can measure. The next column is the number that we're at. So if we look at cost-burdened renter households, according to the data in 2022, there were 6,204 families, households that were cost-burdened. We were looking to identify potentially, if this is a SMART goal, what is that number that we want in 2035 so that we can see how we're doing according to that. It lists the source and then which objectives this is fulfilling. If it's not working towards an objective, it shouldn't be here, and every objective should have at least one of these goals. So this is a chunk of them. Again, we're not going to go over them in detail here, but again, the question would be, given that these all have current data, what should we aim for? This is really a big question, right? What should we be aiming for by 2035? It should be a SMART goal. So 0 maybe is on rent burden, let's say. Is that achievable? That's something to discuss. Clearly the goal is to go down, and by how much? The next slide is very similar. There are additional data points where the data we didn't have at the point of coming to HCDC, but same concept, and wanted to use it as an example of just showing there are a lot of other ways that we can track. It doesn't have to be specifically from Evanston or the census. It could be from other community partners like foreclosures. The Woodstock Institute is a local organization that I've used before in other work to track data. They've released a different data portal. We're not sure if it's going to be a good source moving forward. We want it to be around so that we can go back to it in 5 years and see how we're doing. So are there other goals that we're missing? We don't want 100 goals, but we also want goals that are representative, meaningful, hopefully hitting on at least one of the objectives. So that's another priority question. So going down to that third level of policies, we've listed 5 policy priorities. And within these 5 priorities, there are subcategories, and within the subcategories, then there are policies. So we're not going to go over all. I think there's 84 policies that are listed. We're not going to go over all of those tonight. But these are the 5 priorities. And again, the priority question, these are the places that we would love the feedback so that it can filter down, is we have these 5: create and preserve dedicated affordable housing units, align housing supply with market and neighborhood housing conditions, help households access and afford private market homes. That basically relates to the previous conversation around after a program, that's a private market home situation. Protect against displacement and poor housing conditions, and align housing strategy with climate action goals. So knowing all these are important, limited capacity, limited funds, though we're going to go after more and try to increase, where do we put our focus? What's the appropriate allocation? That direction is really helpful as we move towards the final plan. So for each of these 5, these are the subcategories. I'm just going to leave them on the screen for a moment so you can look at them as we move forward. As you can see, some of them will have more, some of them will have less, and each of these categories in the plan continues additional specific policies. This is the second one. This is focused on access and affordability. focused on displacement and housing conditions. And then the final one at this stage, the aligning housing strategy, there are climate action elements within the other goals as well in terms of reducing utility burden, GHG, et cetera. But we wanted to call this out as a separate one and make sure that we were double checking all the previous ones. Are there gaps? Are there ways that we can align with CARP, et cetera? And so just wanted to call that out here as it's a little different than the others. That's sort of why we've left it blank for now. But it's a charge for us to make that alignment. So as a reminder, there's currently over 80 policies in a lot of categories. The city is currently implementing in some form or another about half of them. And that's another piece that we're going to flesh out more in the final plan. What is the city currently doing? And the prioritization will also help us as we move forward, double down in certain areas, adjust, track over time, and see how we can make sure that we're doing our best to meet our goals. Many of the policies do relate to each other and sometimes work better in a suite, or even though they're in another subcategory, have a lot of connections. We're trying to start pointing those out and pull those together. And as I mentioned before, really it comes from the top. So with strong direction on the objectives, staff and the city can have a better idea of where to go on the policy level. And that could include getting rid of a subcategory that's not appropriate for Evanston, that's not a priority right now. Don't worry about those. We don't need to have, the goal wouldn't be for us to do 80 plus programs all the time, right? This is just, we're trying to throw spaghetti at the wall right now, and then we're trying to stop throwing spaghetti at the wall and then being intentional moving forward. So again, are there additional policies? We're still in that stage. What are we missing? Let's not rule anything out, making sure that it's aligned with our objectives. The resources section has a variety of resources focused. It could be financial resources in terms of grant opportunities. It could be technical, capacity, partnership, financial. It could be policies that other bodies can move forward that we can't on the state or county level, and that's something that we should be aware of, whether partnership opportunities or advocacy. I can imagine in our work going out to the community that this can be expanded that much more based on the knowledge and the expertise of community members and other organizations. So hopefully we've made a good start, and then we'll expand from there. As a reminder, the last two sections we've held off on for now, so they're not in the plan, and I don't have slides for those. I was so excited about the 13 questions, but I don't think this is helping me. There we are. Okay, so as a reminder, these are the 6 questions that are a little bit more high level, that are a little bit more focused on helping us articulate where we're prioritizing and focusing on so that it can trickle down. And then there's also an additional 7 questions on the next slide. We can see if it works now. It does. These are also very important, but are a little bit more specific to certain areas. For example, what would be compelling about the call to action that would lead someone to actually read the document later, and more importantly, join in the effort of implementing the strategies as a community partner or as another government agency. Another example would be, are there specific grants or other resources that should be included? That's changing all the time. It's very important for us to be aware of that. This is a great opportunity to include that in the mix. So I will pause there for any additional questions or discussion.
Let's start with just questions in general, and then go to make sure we answer all of your questions. So, and Ugo, you had a question? If you can remember.
Yeah, I can remember it. My first thought is that maybe implementation of a policy to police policies are followed and complied with initially. So, and what brings that to my thought is that, the plan talks about affordable housing and all of that, but we just witnessed this year in this committee the neglect of the city to follow policies with affordable housing and displacement and then placement. But I was witness to the emotional agony that those residents of the Wesley buildings felt during all that time of uncertainty. And I tell you, I don't wish it on anyone because it was very high. They were not knowing where they go. And I think that somehow we incorporate at a higher level, and I know you touched on it, Uri, on your presentation, that current affordable housing should be a top priority for our plan. And the reason for that is simple. It's just cost. You know, those houses, those units are already in place, housing people that are at affordable rates, either because of subsidies or whatever the case might be for individual units. But to build new affordable housing, I was told by somebody from the city that it is completely unaffordable. Specifically, if you're getting any funds from any type of government grants or anything like that, because then you have to comply with so many requirements to have that affordability be a part of that. So it's unaffordable to build affordable housing. And it costs us a lot more to build new housing than to keep what we have currently, which is not a whole lot. And I wonder with, and I know you probably will talk on the next item on our agenda, so we can probably talk about that then. But so that wasn't really a question. It was more a comment. Sorry about that. I forgot my question. If we go back through the slides, I probably will remember what my question was, but I had specific questions. I didn't see on your metrics there for the SMART goals. I noticed that you had renters of people of color, what the concerns were in Latinx and all of that, but you didn't have a line for the white population in Evanston to have a comparison. What is it to be white in Evanston and what is it to be a person of color? What are our differences really, where we stand across the board? So I think that that will be another metric that I would like to see there, personally. So I probably will think of more questions and I'll see if I have a chance to do it. Thanks.
Yeah, Joanne.
I was just wondering if there has been any looking into estimating what Evanston population will look like in 10 years and how you need to take that into consideration. I mean, we have the elderly population has been increasing, but those people are going to die off. You know what? Hopefully I'll be here in 10 years, but I don't know. And so, you know, and then, you know, again, age-wise, race-wise, what has the city been looking at or estimating?
Yeah, I think with the timing of Envision Evanston 2045, there's an opportunity to align with some of the trends and future pieces that we can incorporate into the strategic housing plan potentially.
What can you give me an idea of what the estimate is of what the population will look like, or is?
I don't have that off the top of my head,
Okay.
and depending on what model you use, I know that the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning uses a model, and there are others that use other models, and they show different things. So I don't have a good summary. I personally wouldn't want to give you one because it's they each have their own sort of bias and unintentional orientation.
Well, but it's certainly, I'm hoping, you know, there will certainly need to be a lot of collaboration between Evanston 2045 and everything else that's the zoning, everything else that's going on. So it certainly is a citywide effort. I just wanted to bring up one thing. It's still said in there, right to first refusal. Can we please? Anyway, just one line was in there. I mean, we will be discussing that later, but that just, as a realtor and a landlord, that is just not necessary in this city. Has it ever happened? I don't know that any, maybe high-end tenants can afford to buy, their properties, but not those in affordable housing units, which I have. My 4-bedroom units go for $2,400, so very affordable for that size unit.
Okay, Councilmember Harakaris.
Yeah, so Joanne, I just had one thought when you were talking about the population aging here. I would be curious also to see how that percentage has gone up based on certain developments like the senior living facilities and how they've affected the demographics in the area. So that would actually probably, I would guess, that number would probably stay flat because those housing units are probably almost full all the time. So one little piece of feedback, I think it's the initial kind of call to action. I think, at least for me personally, the idea of helping to keep Evanstonians in Evanston. I know that, at least in my ward, there's a lot of folks that are stretched thin and are paying more than 30%, up to 50%. All those metrics, I think we want to, lower those numbers. I think there's also a question to be had, like me personally, I would like to see us have more residents. I think having a more robust housing supply, there's plenty of folks that would love to live here but can't. And I think having as many units available at different costs, I think would help across the board. And so I know like a lot of this ties into zoning and what is allowed, but I know one of my personal frustrations has been that, I've been on council for 2.5, almost 3 years, and there has not been that many developments that we've been able to approve and see constructed yet. It takes a really long time, and so I know there's challenges to shortening that time frame. But I think my first meeting we approved the South Boulevard development, and it still hasn't happened. And that's I think 60 units, 60 affordable units, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that's like 60 people. So that it's a big impact. So those are kind of so I think helping maybe shorten the timeline on some of these developments, and I'll leave that for now.
Great, thank you. Fran?
Thank you. This kind of dovetails into your question, Councilman. I opened up the electronic news from Evanston Roundtable this morning and noticed that there's a Church Street Plaza plans for a 27-story building, including 72 affordable housing units that's being planned. And I'm just kind of curious how that comports with the current plans or goals, and speaking to Mr. Rodriguez's concerns about affordable housing units, what sizes will those be? Will they be studio apartments, 1 bedroom? I'm just kind of curious if we're working towards these goals. This huge 27-story building seems to be of interest, and I think it should be of interest to us now. And I don't know at what stage have there been approvals for that building No, okay.
Not yet. Very early stages.
Yeah, I think, Liz, are you familiar with, they've submitted for a zoning analysis, I believe?
That's correct. So that particular project is in the preliminary review stage of applications, so have not even formally applied for relief that would be required to construct it. So it still has to travel through an application process that would require land use and city council approval. And then, of course, building permits after that and construction.
Got it. The second question is, and this is just a general, very, very theoretical question, but has there ever been stock taken of the a number of empty buildings just in the Evanston downtown area and empty businesses? I sometimes will drive through a whole block and see abandoned businesses. And how much of that real estate could be converted more easily into housing that could be affordable rather than going out and trying to start from square one, especially taking into consideration climate action goals of using what we have and repurposing that?
Yeah, that's a good question. That definitely aligns with most of the plans and projects that we're doing right now. That's definitely something that's being considered in Vision Evanston 2045 in terms of the comprehensive plan and the zoning code in terms of like what allowable uses in different situations. I do, from general conversations with folks in the field, it seems like the conversion from office to residential is often more difficult than we would like it to be. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be considering that and evaluating and assessing. It's just something to note that the way that the floor plans are constructed and various other components in terms of plumbing can make it more costly or more difficult than we would like it to be.
Of course.
Okay. Councilmember Harakaris?
Yeah, so I just want to piggyback on something that Ugo had mentioned earlier about price setting software. So one of the new trends with the larger housing providers is to use rental pricing software. Sure. We have that. I made a referral recently so that we're going to be discussing that, but a referral to ban the use of that in Evanston. That's like a possibility that we're looking into. So it's been shown that like nationwide that this leads to basically collusion and price fixing and raising the costs across the board for everyone, especially as more and more of the big housing providers use that. Yeah, and from what I've read also, like when I first got on this committee, I remember thinking like we should figure out how to convert office buildings, but from what I've read, the plumbing situation is the most expensive just because, you know, there's like plumbing stacks on one side of the building and yeah, so, but yeah, if there was an easy way to do that, I wish we could because there's definitely space downtown.
Okay. Chloe, is that your right? Or is it, Councilmember Burns? Yeah. I'm sorry.
First off, I want to say thank you to Uri. I don't want this to get lost that the city has not always had a housing planner. And so for many years, you know, we had staff that wore multiple hats and did the best they could to help us think about new policy changes. But this position is a new position, senior housing planner, and it is why we're able to get this level of presentation today. So I just want to thank staff and Director Flax, who I don't think is here, for adding this new position. I don't want that to get lost. That is something that is a new addition to our city. I also want to say, because Wesley was brought up, that many of the tenants in Wesley were seniors who were low income on fixed incomes and honestly couldn't afford much of the what we call naturally occurring affordable housing because they didn't make enough. Because we know this because we did a intense search for affordable housing for the residents of Wesley. We didn't only witness their agony, but we stepped in to try to help. And so we understand that there isn't enough affordable housing for people who are lower income, fixed income. We need subsidized housing, right? Bottom line, we need more either through the housing choice voucher program. So having more housing choice vouchers circulated in our area, or having what they call new project-based affordable housing developments in Evanston, which is South Boulevard, which is Church and Darrow, which is et cetera. We need that. And we literally needed that to be able to address the situation on Wesley a lot faster. Because we don't have that available, what happened is all those residents are now under a city subsidy program, right? So because the market didn't provide that subsidy, the city stepped in to provide the subsidy. So literally every single resident, all 19 households on Wesley, are in a rental subsidy program that's funded by the city. So we need more subsidized housing, especially if we want to help people who are deeply lower income. So that's one. Two, I was able to read much of this, but I'm probably going to repeat a lot of what's here. There's a lot of information here. I think this is an excellent start. In terms of a compelling summary, just making sure that we're adding personal stories, I think is really important and probably would be the most compelling. I chair the NWDB committee, and one of our members mentioned that if people knew that when we're talking about affordability, we're talking about somebody that works in the food services department or division at Northwestern, or we're talking about the person that might be, picking up, who's in waste management, picking up your recycling can. If we're talking about a school teacher, we're talking about your neighbors. And so I think if we can, if that can be a part of that call to action, that this is not about someone else from some other community that's trying to invade your neighborhood. These are your neighbors that we're talking about. I think that would help. I guess this is a question. Do we have anything in here which talks about that just the present day disparities in rent burden, home ownership, et cetera, for different minority groups? Do we plan to touch on that at all?
So for the draft, we stuck generally with all of Evanston and sort of one subset group, and didn't go into crosstabs of all of those pieces.
But you plan to?
We actually have some of that data already, just didn't dump it all in. But if there's a million permutations that we can run with that. If there are specific ones like the ones you just mentioned that would be particularly helpful to focus on, that's helpful for us to throw that in the mix to make sure that we're tracking those pieces and highlighting those disparities.
Yeah, I think we need data on displacement patterns, particularly ones that are affecting our Black and Hispanic Latinx residents. There's a group, especially our African American community, where if you look at the data, that is being displaced more than anybody else, and I don't think any housing plan should ignore that. We need to name it and try to understand why that's happening to that particular group. So I think that's important. It's included. Also, any analysis? Do we plan to have an analysis on affordability trends, and then looking at that in terms of how that's matched local wages over time?
So we do have, not currently included, but we've been looking at actually more related potentially to the inclusionary housing piece of when we say this AMI, who are we talking about, and where a variety of other pieces are in terms of local policy that aren't specifically AMI, like minimum wage or entry salary at District 65 for a teacher or a graduate student at Northwestern, or those types of pieces. So you can sort of see, I think it's sort of related to the neighbor piece that you were mentioning.
Yeah.
If the wages piece in particular is something that you want us to focus on, obviously that directly relates to the ability to pay for housing. We can do that as well.
I think it's important. I've always talked about affordability as in two parts. One, kind of lowering rents, lowering the cost to own, but also raising incomes. And, we have a workforce development department and, and other resources that we dedicate towards helping people connect with new career path, increase their income. So I think that is an important piece to include, to help people understand that although housing costs has gone up, what can we say about incomes? Have they gone up? And has the opportunity to increase your income, has that opportunity gone up at all? Or are those jobs more available, especially the Evanston residents. I think infographics, mapping tools, anything like that would be incredibly helpful. I think we want to make sure that that this report is accessible to any and everyone, that they can easily digest it and understand it and explain it to someone else that they run into. So any way we can make that happen, I think is important. I'm curious about the goals. So what type of goals are we thinking about right now when we talk about kind of actionable goals? Can you talk about one or two that you think are going to be really important?
Sure. So I can go back to those. We did not include specific numbers for this conversation and getting feedback on not necessarily an exact number, but a general, this really needs to move in a significant way.
Okay.
We need to push harder on that. So that's
helpful.
These are actually the ones that we don't have data on yet. These are the first bucket that I would focus on more since we already have that data. So as you can see, some here are housing choice vouchers, cost burden, electric heat, homeownership amongst Black, Latino, and Asian population, new housing units. That one's slightly different than the other pieces because instead of being fixed at 2022, it's per year, and it's an average of 2000 to 2020.
Okay.
And then missing middle housing units, which we're defining as single family attached to 19 units and excluding 20 or more and single family detached. And then a couple around cost and proximity to transit.
Okay. I want to think more about this, but I'll kind of reach out and I'll have some thoughts about that. Short-term housing solutions, has that come up at all yet, or what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I'm probably going in the wrong direction here. So there are a couple areas that show up, specifically protecting against displacement and poor housing conditions. But they do show up in other areas, including affording private market homes, because subsidies, vouchers, et cetera, can allow you to live in there not needing the subsidy to be attached to the unit.
Okay.
I think just looking, these are not subsidy related, neither are these. But this one in particular, tenant-based rental assistance, housing trade vouchers are a couple main categories here, and I think here as well.
And I think what I would want to add, because I don't know if it's just emergency short-term solutions, because we run into that a lot, as Sue is nodding her head knows. We need some way to address emergencies, so to house people temporarily in an emergency, and then that may lead to them getting a 2-year subsidy, which then leads to them getting a more permanent subsidy. But I would say we should definitely add emergency short-term housing solutions. I'll pause there, and that's pretty much it for now.
Okay, Joanne?
Yeah, so what about schools? We're going to be closing some schools. Are they easier to convert than office buildings or not? I mean, is there a little more plumbing in schools?
That's a good question. Right. I mean, I think from my perspective, the place that we're at right now, as much as I said that it's harder to do, we want to look into it and find a way to do it, right? If that's important for achieving our goals and finding new technologies, new partners, new funding sources to make that possible. So that's definitely on the radar.
Yeah. Then Jan Jakowski has a luncheon for realtors every year, and I went, and asked her, can we get increased housing funds in the federal government? We need to be contacting our legislators to see if we can, increase the number of vouchers, because it's still 10-year waiting list for vouchers. I don't know what the current is, but, that's ridiculous. I'm sure people die waiting to get a voucher. So we always need to try to get more from the federal government. Then as a realtor, I am seeing houses just, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 houses in Evanston because we don't have enough to sell. Selling for $100,000 more than asking price, and that's even with interest rates up, although they're coming down. And then I went to a luncheon recently where this eviction lawyer said, or foreclosure lawyer said, we could be facing foreclosures a lot in a few years. You know, people are paying so much for housing, and then if there's a recession, you know, we could go through foreclosures again, which would be a disaster for a lot of people.
Okay. Councilmember Harris.
Yeah, when we're looking at the climate goals and how that relates to housing, I would just hope that you folks could work closely with CNT and Elevate. They're running the Green Homes pilot program. Recently had a discussion with them about trying to get the word out to get more people signed up for the pilot program. But I think when you think about it, kind of affordability, you know, there's also the piece like, you know, how do you make your current home, if you're a homeowner, more efficient to stay at? So I think especially as we get more extreme weather, like, you know, updating, you know, your drainage, like, you know, just anecdotally, you know, you have neighbors like, you know, when we have like these big storms, like, you know, have a flooded basement, and that's, even if you have insurance, that can come at a great cost. And so like, that's like kind of these emergency situations come up. And so like, you know, kind of improving and, you know, helping people modernize and improve their homes. I think that would be another way to, you know, allow people to stay longer in their current home, and also would be beneficial for, you know, housing providers. You know, if you have, you know, a 3-flat or, you know, a small building, you know, cutting your utility costs and cutting your heating costs could, you know, make it easier for them to keep their rents down, you know, so.
Thanks, first of all. I am grateful for all of this. So I wanted to add to this point about sort of CARP, but also just the older housing stock in general. And I'm wondering if sort of more can be done to think about how some of the other priorities kind of overlap or conflict with some of the challenges of having the older housing stock too. So for example, if sort of naturally occurring affordable housing tends to be older, I'm assuming, I would think that would be sort of likely, especially if we have like 40% is built pre-1940 in the city. What does that mean for the specific challenges for sort of climate resilience, for sort of, you know, you mentioned enforcement, but we need to be realistic also about the costs of the real costs of compliance, since we're trying to sort of look at everything clear-eyed, you know. So what could we estimate it would cost to bring housing up to code that's older and might be a little bit less likely? And then sort of what are there certain populations or areas that sort of have higher prevalences of housing that's in need of sort of preservation, I guess. It's different, it means different things in different parts of the city. But in terms of retrofitting for climate resilience, and also just to bring up to health standards. So that's kind of one set of thoughts that I had about this. You mentioned, I think one of your questions is sort of what, there are a lot of questions.
I know.
So
not asking everyone to answer all of them
yeah,
tonight.
and you're asking like community spirited people from around the community
Yes.
if policies should be removed, which no one's ever going to say yes. But one of the things I was thinking about, sort of where some of these different objectives speak to each other, and I mean, it seems pretty clear that supply is one of the sort of issues that ties a lot of these different objectives together. And so sort of reducing barriers to construction of market rate housing can help in a variety of ways. And I suppose that, I mean, if we could think about like supply plus stability plus creating things that existing residents who can sometimes also be barriers to approving this sort of change also value. Perhaps I think the power of narrative is really helpful there too. Sort of reminding people that this is really good for your community. It's not just sort of giving something to developers, which I don't mean pejoratively, but sort of if you look at public opinion, people tend to sort of when you ask them why they don't want to increase housing supply, some of it has to do with this sort of deep-seated sense that it's sort of benefiting developers at their expense. And, you know, if we can think of different ways to change that narrative, I don't think that's entirely correct. I think, you know, we need to think about how it benefits our community as a whole. So I wanted to second Councilmember Burns's point about just sort of, you know, bringing in narrative, reminding people of sort of who we're actually thinking about when we're thinking about this, but also just to highlight that I think supply ends up getting, if we could think about supply plus stability, that touches on a lot of these different issues, especially just expansion of the missing middle here. I had a question. I was just wondering, I was at one of the Envision Evanston 2045 meetings, and it came up a lot that there was sort of a bit of an age skew in terms of participation in those public meetings. So it tended to be older and sort of people that didn't have, you know, school-age kids. And I noticed that families did come up as one of the lists of 50 different priority populations within the city. But I was kind of curious as to how represented that community was in the community input that you received for this.
Sure.
Yeah.
My short answer is I'm not sure because
Okay.
we didn't ask
Yeah. Okay.
for that type of information.
Yeah.
A lot of the input, I actually don't remember the exact breakdown, but there was a chunk of input from the community, residents, other community members, and then a chunk of input that was from organizations, folks who are either on the board or staff that were presenting, providing input. So I don't know off the top of my head on this one because we tried to keep it pretty simple in terms of what we were asking, so we didn't have that demographic information. The hope is when receiving input from organizations, they have the pulse and are in touch with enough populations that we're getting a representative sample through them, but it is not the same as hearing directly from someone.
Okay. Thanks. I was just curious about that. I mean, in general, there's so much here. I don't want to add to the list of things that I think it's pretty comprehensive. If anything, I think some of these different categories, again, could be collapsed. Some are sort of really about supply, or that's kind of maybe the root issue. The other, I think, set of things have to do with sort of maintaining and preserving, sort of bringing things up to standards, sort of, I think the health and environmental goals kind of fit in there as well. I'll stop there. I guess the other thing I'll say, just to also second, is I think in terms of providing sort of the 10-year sort of look at changes in affordability, it would be really helpful to me too to have some sense of how wages and incomes factor into. It's not. It would just. I think that's necessary in order to understand the context. But this is really great. I think this is just such excellent planning. So,
Right. Fran?
Yes. I just want to second anybody here tonight who said this is an amazing report, because it is very, very impressive what you've put together. And thank you for doing that. Getting into the weeds a little bit, and because I'm kind of the newest person on the committee, where do the in lieu fees go if developers choose to pay in lieu fees rather than support an AMI, a certain percentage of AMI?
Those go to the Affordable Housing Fund, and we will also talk about that in greater detail at the next discussion right after this about the Inclusionary Housing Ordinance.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, that's where the dollars go, and they're restricted to be spent on housing for folks under 80% AMI. Is that correct, Marion? For sale, yes. Okay, so at 100% AMI is the
Right.
max for that.
Yeah, and I noticed you did a lot of work looking into the efforts that other cities have made. And I was just wondering, was that kind of the incentive or reason or impetus for increasing the in lieu fees? Proposed in lieu fees are much higher than they are now. Is that for incentivizing developers to go with the percentage of AMIs rather than, or just as an income producer too?
Yeah, I'm just going to pause on that because we're going to talk about it in detail
Okay.
in the next one, and
Sure.
we'll jump in. Just want to make sure we have an opportunity to wrap on
Certainly.
there. But no, it's fine. I'm excited to have that conversation, and
Okay.
I'm glad you're excited too as well.
Okay, Councilmember Burns?
Yeah, just to kind of double up on what was said about just the stories. I mentioned stories. Clay mentioned stories. I think one of the ways, just to give an example, we have people who have had concerns about our inclusionary housing ordinance and how effective it is. And there's always obviously room for improvement. There's a delicate balance, that we have to consider as a city, which we'll talk more about in the next discussion. But there can always be improvement. But one thing that I've tried to remind people of, if you knock on one of those doors and happen to talk to somebody that's in one of the units, I guarantee they're probably incredibly grateful for that unit and for that opportunity. And I'm not saying that the city deserves any more credit than any more credit than we've already been given. But that's why I think it's important to really emphasize the stories of people who both need this different housing, especially affordable housing, but also the people who currently benefit from it. So I think if you were to ask them how they feel about the program, they would describe it much differently than I've heard other people describe it in the community. So again, just centering people who, again, need it, which is not always what we hear. We oftentimes, and I'm talking more about affordable housing, but we often hear from people who don't necessarily need affordable housing, but they're around a potential affordable housing development. We hear a lot from them, and that's great, but usually we only hear from them. So making sure that we're also hearing people who need it and people who currently benefit from it. I think that's incredibly important. And then I also think it would be important to understand how new development impacts affordability. That's a big one that we always hear is in both, new development, new affordable development, new market rate development. How does that impact affordability? How does that impact displacement? It'd be nice to dig into that, because right now, because we haven't looked at it closely as a city, people have kind of drawn their own conclusions, which are probably not accurate, whether it's coming from me or anyone else, if it's not based in anything. And so I would love to explore that. New development, home sales, how that impacts if a home sells for $700,000 on a block where most of the homes sell for $350,000. How does that impact affordability? And also other improvements, skate parks and other things. Because again, we've had people who have brought these things up, and so let's explore it. I'm probably going to describe this in the wrong way, but I know I've heard something where there's a belief that there are currently people who are living in units that probably should be living in more suitable units, and the units they're living in should probably, if they were available, maybe they're more affordable. So if they were available, then we would have more affordable housing supply. There's something like that I've heard. And so I want to understand what that looks like in Evanston. Is that playing out in Evanston? If so, how is it? It's a scenario or a theory that I've heard, but I don't think it's ever been explored. We've talked about it, and I know I'm not explaining it correctly, but
Can I just clarify? So
please,
I know,
yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
Do you mean if someone who can afford, someone who's making a household's making $100,000 and they're in a unit that's let's do it by month to keep it
Yeah.
simpler. They're making $10,000 a month and the rent is $1,000. If they move to an apartment that was more expensive that they still could afford than someone else who made $3,000
I think
could
that's
move
the
into
theory.
that
I
like
think, I think
like a
that's the theory.
mismatch.
I think we've all heard it, what I'm talking about. Exactly. But it's one of the cases for like the fact that we need more housing supply. So I'm saying whatever those arguments are, let's bring it from theory and try to bring it more local and understand if that's playing out in Evanston, and if so, how, if that makes sense. And that's all. Thank you.
Okay. Well, excuse me, I think I better chime in a little bit here, and then we can move on to the rest of our agenda. So I think, Councilmember Burns, what you're talking about is just helping the community understand that we just have a need for more supply altogether, because right now, if there's not a housing opportunity for this person making $10,000 a month, they are going to stay in the less expensive apartment, and that puts the pressure then on the housing supply for lower income people. So, well, I think you've gotten some really great feedback from the committee. It's really, I second everything everybody's been saying. I was wondering, in the list of local housing resources, whether there was anything to be gleaned from looking back at the Affordable Housing Plan Steering Committee work in 2019, 2020. Because we talked a lot about the need for general density, and we had some findings. So I just was wondering whether there was anything there to pull into the plan.
That's definitely one of the resources we're
Okay.
looking at. I don't remember the specifics that may have
Right.
come out of that, but that's a good reminder to see if there's anything more we can glean.
Right, okay. And I remember from that effort, learning that our older population is growing, and even though they may not continue, that percentage of the population may not continue to grow, but it's gone up. So the 2022 numbers were 17% of residents 65 years or older, but in 2012 it was only 11% of our residents. So I think we do really need to think about the housing opportunities for our older residents, that's stability, because they want to stay in the community where they've lived all these years. They need accessibility. They need safety. So I would just encourage us to keep our senior citizens in mind. And then I see Councilmember Harikar has another light on.
Yeah, this discussion that Councilmember Burns brought up made me think of kind of just from, experience, in my community, my group of friends, knowing that there's a lot of people who would love to buy and are renting, and because the real estate market is so tight, I think it'd be good to get, numbers, or try to, get to, kind of a baseline of how many folks out there are in this situation. But there are plenty of people who would love to buy a condo or a home and are, stable economically and just can't find something and really do not want to move from the neighborhood. I think that's kind of speaks to like this, that, the story that, we're seeing with, some of the housing. So.
Chloe.
Yeah, this I think goes to this point too. While we're telling stories, I've experienced this too, and with my kids' classmates, right? People want to stay in the community. I just lost my train of thought. Actually, I had a point I was going to make, but I'll just say one other thing that also came to mind. Which is, I'm just curious about how we think about the how questions of sort of the broader built environment come into some of this too. I think it comes up when we're thinking about accessibility for an aging population, when we're talking about transit-oriented development and sort of proximity to different types of transit. One thing that I think the city should think more about, and I would love to see it sort of mentioned maybe, is just pedestrian safety. There's, I think it's called Vision 2020, right? The Vision Zero. Thank you. Yeah, I'm getting 2020, 2045. But, I don't know that our streets are all that safe for pedestrians. Senior citizens are very much at risk of, and in fact, we've had a few incidents where senior citizens have been hit by cars. I think my kids always feel like they're at risk. I think a lot of, but it would be really nice to also sort of just think about that aspect too when we're thinking about housing and in the context of the sort of more comprehensive, maybe visionary kind of plan of, what we can imagine. And so now I'm also treading into the Envision Evanston agenda, but just, I guess I would point that out here too, since, we're thinking about community development. And I think that sort of safety for people who are living in and walking in the community is important when we're thinking about the age profile of our population, when we're thinking about our climate goals, and also when we're thinking about just trying to build around sort of areas that maybe don't require as much reliance on cars, because then the importance of walkable, safe areas that, you don't have to worry about getting hit by a car or it really becomes all the more important. So.
Great. Okay. And Councilmember Burns?
Yeah, last 2 points. We may not have enough like entry level homes, where in Evanston people feel sometimes that their first home should be, something that may be unattainable for a starter home or an entry level home. And so just trying to understand how available are condos, as one housing type, I think is important. Aging in place is something I think is incredibly important. I would love to better understand if it's currently attainable and if so, for which groups, and then just really mapping out what that looks like. Because to me, when I think of someone who's on a fixed income, maybe living alone, although I know they may be comfortable in a single family home, it just seems like there's a lot of responsibility that comes with home ownership. A single family home traditionally at least feels like something that is easier to maintain and afford, when there's more than one person in the household, when you have a need for that much space. And so I think it's important for us to really try to understand, what does aging in place mean? Is continuing to live in the home that you may have raised children in practical today? And if so, how? Is it ADUs? How is it practical, especially considering taxes probably will, even though they've held in Evanston for a few years now, they likely will go up. So just really understanding what that means and how we can achieve it here in Evanston. And that's it. That really is it this time. Thank you.
Joanne? Okay.
Well, I just want to say, properties available have gone up a little bit. Yesterday I looked and there were 48 houses and 49 condos available. And when I looked, say 3 months ago, it was 30. So our supply has gone up a little bit, but prices certainly haven't come down. But anyway, and interest rates I read are supposed to be around 6% next year, or something. So we'll see. That'll help too.
Okay. Ugo, go ahead.
Thank you. A couple of comments on the aging population that is coming to Evanston, or is 10% or 11% back in 2012. Now it's 17%. A couple of things that come to mind are, one is we all age. So those could be 57-year-old back in 2012, and now they're 67. Case in point, me. So that's one. Two is typically older folks have more resources financially, so they're the ones who can afford to move into Evanston. Senior living in Evanston is pretty pricey. I mean, across the board in general. I know that there are some affordable senior setups, but not many. I think that the majority of that growth of seniors has come because seniors have more wealth than younger families or younger people. So That's my comment to that. And to comment to something that Councilmember Burns mentioned, that the person who earns, in keeping with your example of the $10,000 a month family income, living in a $1,000 apartment, but they could afford more, they say move to a $3,400 apartment per month, or mortgage payment, housing payment for a condo or a house. That $1,000 a month unit, it's not necessarily going to be $1,000, because that landlord now sees that this tenant's had it for $1,000, but I see that the market now is closer to $1,500 or $1,800. So that affordability doesn't necessarily stay at that level. And most landlords will look at it that way, because it is a business, regardless of how we want to see it. It's housing, but it's also a business. So doesn't necessarily translate new development, especially if we're talking about higher end new housing at any level, condos, single family, whatever. Doesn't necessarily translate that the unit that these folks were holding in Evanston is going to stay at that affordable pricing. Maybe they were there for 10 years. These people save for 10 years to have a down payment and now be able to afford that. Situations change in their lives in terms of income, so now they're able to buy a house. But that affordable unit is most likely not going to stay at the same level, at least in general. I would say that is what I see on the market. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, boy.
Remember where it was going now. So when I had asked about sort of the, the representation of sort of families, or, people maybe with kids or school age kids, I guess part of the concern, and it goes a bit to Ugo's point too, is about sort of thinking about, well, who are the senior citizens who are coming into town, or who are we measuring, right? Are they people who are coming to Evanston? Are they people who've lived in Evanston? And I do worry a little bit when we're thinking about sort of projecting demand based on sort of current trends, that we're not necessarily seeing the families who had to leave Evanston. And it says here that, it's sort of suggestive that families with kids are not, there are fewer than previously. I think one of the groups of one of the age ranges maybe increased a little bit, but the sort of other ones decreased. And so that was the concern in terms of how we're forecasting. Since, if we're using this data, then we need to also think about those people who aren't here anymore because they don't have that missing middle housing, and, move to communities where maybe you can get a starter home and you can maybe even plan on moving to a different house in the same community later, and that might not be an option here.
Well, I think we've touched on just about every tricky issue here for you, Uri, and thank you very much for just the amazing amount of work that you've put into this already, and we look forward to the next discussion. And I think we better now move on to the Inclusionary Housing Ordinance. Are you in charge of that one too? Okay, go for it.
Thank you again for your feedback on the last item. I really do appreciate it. We the whole community development department appreciates the feedback. That's going to lead to hopefully a stronger, better, more implementable plan. Again, I'm Uri Pachter, senior housing planner. We're now talking about Inclusionary Housing Ordinance. If you can take a big leap from 10-year time frame and a draft of big picture objectives and zoom in to a specific ordinance that we've had in Evanston for a chunk of time and that we've updated and revised multiple times. We're now on that specific proposal. There's a draft language in the memo. There's a variety of other comparisons of other municipalities, as Fran mentioned before, and proposed changes. So now we are really in the weeds and looking to get your feedback on the specific proposal so that next time we can move to recommend to City Council and go through the legislative process. As a reminder, it wouldn't go into effect until basically Q2 of 2025, so that would align with the zoning code, and so that if there were any things that weren't matched up properly, there would also be some time to rectify that, and there wouldn't be like multiple versions happening at the same time. But we are in a tight time frame to stick with our schedule and City Council's goal to increase the minimum requirements during 2024. So on that note, we will get started. So as a reminder, that is the first key reason why we're here, is a City Council goal. The last IHO also requires a review of the ordinance due to COVID and other capacity issues. It's been delayed. So we're looking at more than just increasing the minimum requirement. And generally, it's best practice to look at it regularly to try to thread the needle and make sure that the ordinance, the program, is maximizing the potential for units. If you're requiring too little, you're not getting very many units. If you're requiring too much, you're probably not getting very many units. And that changes all the time. So this is another opportunity to look at that. Not going to read through all the focused topics that we went through in June, but just a reminder, there were 2 that were added by this committee specifically to increase housing production. And then the second one was aligning with climate action goals. The previous 7 were ones that were presented at our last meeting, and they're amended as recommended. And we met in June. We've received feedback from a variety of sources and had a series of research conversations, which have been summarized in the packet, and we'll go over in a little bit of detail later on in the presentation. And so we're back with the draft ordinance, and next month we'll be discussing a revised version based on your recommendations. So at a high level, the update that's before you includes 4 components. 1 is an increase to the minimum requirement as directed by City Council. 2, a focus on predictability and flexibility for providers of inclusionary housing units. 3, increasing the number and variety of units to better address the housing needs of the community. And 4, increasing protections against losing Evanston's racial and economic diversity. Some of these are very specific, one thing in the ordinance. Other ones are a little bit more general that it's trying to get at for multiple components, but these are ways that we're trying to summarize what's here before you. And part of those questions, again, are we achieving those goals from the focus topics? Is this aligned, et cetera? As requested previously, here's a general summary of inclusionary housing unit production over time, broken down into 4 phases. 1, before the inclusionary housing ordinance was approved, there were negotiated agreement with a developer for units, and then units that were privy to were needed to be compliant with the ordinance that was approved in 2007, 2016, and the current one, which was approved in 2019. The middle couple columns are the number of units and the in lieu fees that were submitted by the developer to the Affordable Housing Fund. As a reminder, in 2007, the in lieu fee was $40,000 per unit. In 2016, it was $75,000 to $100,000 per unit. In 2019, it was $150,000 to about $262,000, and that's increased with inflation. So right now it's about $180,000 to $314,000. So what the couple columns are on the right takes those conversions, which are different based on the different policies, and converts those into units because those were deemed equivalent more or less by the ordinance, by saying instead of providing this unit, you can opt out and provide in lieu fees. And so converted that into a unit equivalent in terms of number of units and a percent, just to sort of convey and put together the dollar amounts that came in through the in lieu fees and not sort of dismiss them as not counted. So as you can see, there were 94 physical units, and in terms of unit equivalency, 131. And the percentage has to do with the total number of units that were in the developments from these negotiated agreements or that were required to be in compliance with the IHO, not taking into account developments that maybe were not needing to comply in a previous one and then were later, or any other market dynamics, but just looking at the total number of units in those developments. Next, my clicker will pause working. Thank you. An additional component of the summary looks at, of those total physical units of 94 units, what are the maximum incomes or rent for each unit, and what are the bedroom options. So as you can see, in general, most of the units are 60 to 80% AMI, and most of the units are studio or one bedroom. That's what's been produced to date, and that is an important baseline to understand what we're talking about. Again, this ordinance is entirely reliant on developer production and that component. So there could be a downturn and no units are produced. That doesn't necessarily mean that the ordinance is ineffective. It's just not currently aligned with the market, the housing market. So that's the past. That does not, like any stock market projection, that does not mean anything for the future, but it is important for us to note. So a few other takeaways. So on average, we're looking at about 5 units per year and below the 10% requirement, even though it was 10% the whole way through. Reasons include that are not limited to language in the ordinance leads to a reduced requirement calculation that is less than 10%. 2, in lieu fees incentivize developers to opt out of on-site units. 3, there were narrow definitions of what a covered development is. Those are the developments that are required to comply. So there are exemptions or negotiated agreements that the developer doesn't have to comply and therefore ends up being often a lower rate. And then lastly, changes that are outside of control, like COVID, that can influence production. So through our many conversations with developers that have worked in Evanston and gone through the process, that's the first slide. The next one will include local, regional, and national experts around inclusionary housing policies. These are some of the takeaways that we wanted to highlight. There's more detail in the memo. The pre-development process is very unpredictable and hard to navigate. As you remember, that correlates with one of the things we're trying to alleviate in our overall update. In lieu fees are much less expensive than providing on-site units. That's from the developers themselves. Strong support for county tax incentives. We talked a little bit in the last time about some new county tax incentives. Many of the developers are proposing, planning, working on developments in and around the Chicago area at 20% affordability. And that's very different from before, where Evanston's ordinance at 10% was very different from surrounding areas. Chicago and maybe a couple other places had an ordinance. Now developers are looking to build 20% because of this incentive. Next, there's some modest concern about raising the requirement, with a particular focus on small developers or smaller developments. That's where more of the concern lied. And there was an interest in, well, if you're going to increase the requirements, can you lower pre-development costs? Can you lower ongoing expenses to help offset that? And lastly, zoning bonuses are only effective if the development is approved. And just to be clear, because I think I've mentioned this to a couple other folks after this was posted, and there was a little confusion. So basically, that's just saying you can get the bonus, but if the development doesn't actually happen, then what did it do? And if it's not ultimately approved, then the units aren't built, then the process didn't work for the purposes of the developer or for the program. In terms of national and regional experts, again, there was a focus on predictability and flexibility to developers. That's definitely something that's best practice across the country. Tightening ordinance language to remove exemptions and exceptions. A shift, before we were talking about calculating the in lieu fee based on construction costs. There are a variety of models. We looked more into it, and the recommended approach was based off of the reduced revenue of a unit, the difference between a market rate unit and that unit being an inclusionary housing unit, and what that difference in revenue would be over a 30-year period, which is the period that we'd be requiring that unit. That's the actual difference for a developer in terms of cost versus construction, which would more be a separate development that a third party might produce. That is what some people do. However, it tends to be pretty disconnected to the financial incentives of the developer. There was a concern about going over 20% as a requirement without providing subsidies or allowing higher income caps, as seen as in other communities. That's not sustainable without those other components. There was a recommendation to be mindful of recent developer cost increases in terms of financing, labor, and materials. There was, they mentioned encouraging units above the minimum through incentives. Our current ordinance does not continue all of the incentives after the minimum, which in some level disincentivizes doing more than the minimum. So turning that on its head and making sure that that's not the case if we're interested in more. And just in general, making data-driven decisions, whether that's right now or moving forward as we evaluate the program and continue to improve it. So the updates that we're proposing include two categories. The first one I call independent updates. There's a variety of specific individual updates that aren't necessarily related one to another, but are ways to improve the program in different areas of the ordinance. Here are some examples. So there's a policies and procedures document that right now is very limited into what it's focused and provides more ambiguity because there's not much outside of the ordinance, and expanding more detail and putting that in the ordinance. The city manager would approve that, and everything would need to be aligned with the ordinance, would allow for the program to function more successfully. Providing an annual report to this committee so that we can do that data-driven analysis and see how we're meeting our targets, if we're not, what the causes are, et cetera. Looking at rental affordability period calculated by development instead of by units. Basically, what that means is if there's a new development that has 10 units, that whole group wraps up, unfortunately, after 30 years of being required to be affordable, and they all happen at the same time instead of having individual dates, and it's very complicated to track. As we talked about in the last meeting, the zoning bonus section is moving to the zoning code and is being addressed through the land use committee and through Envision Evanston. This committee will have an opportunity to review and make a recommendation as part of that process, and make sure that it's aligned with the requirements that are being recommended. And lastly, looking to improve the enforcement of the program, and if there's non-compliance, making sure that we have the ability to do so. Those are examples. There are others that are, again, sort of independent changes. The next section is a suite of updates that are somewhat interconnected, and by moving something in one way, it potentially affects another one. We're very much interested in hearing if any of those changes need to be made. Just want to make that caveat that when that happens, what are the effects of that, and how does everything need to be reoriented? That's not something that can be calculated easily live during this discussion, but we can take it all in and see how we can readjust if needed to make sure that we're achieving our goals. So I'll go through this one line by line. So the left section are the category. Then we have where we're at currently, what we're proposing, and a summary of why this proposed change. So the first one is the minimum number of units. So currently, if a development has 4 units or fewer, it's not a covered development and does not need to be in compliance. We're proposing to raise that to 7 for a couple of reasons. One, that encourages supply and reduces restrictions on development on that lower level around 5 and 6. And 2, the Cook County incentive program that developers were telling us that they're proposing units, 20% of units at affordability starts at 7. And by having alignment there, there's just some simplicity and ease in terms of conveying the program instead of having a variety of starting points. The next one, the requirement, a development that has 100 units theoretically would be required to provide 10%. As I mentioned, the wording right now means we're often receiving less than 10%. The new requirement would be 15%, and it would be 15%. The calculation would be that straightforward. 100 is 15. There's no other way of doing it. So we would get the 15% that we're looking for. 3, currently, if there's public money, it's twice as much. It's 20% instead of 10%. We're proposing to stick with that twice as much alignment, that ratio. So moving that to 30% if there's public dollars involved in the development. The other piece of encouraging smaller developers and missing middle development is for smaller developments currently, the per unit cost is higher for 5 to 7 unit developments than at any other level if you track it out the way our ordinance is laid out. So that's punitive for those smaller developers. As I mentioned, that's not something we're interested in continuing. So not only are we not doing that, but we're proposing that the 15% has a little bit different calculation, which is listed in the ordinance, and the in lieu fees are a little bit lower to make that on-ramp a little bit easier for smaller developers, smaller developments from 7 to 14 units. And then the last piece on this slide is the in lieu fee per unit. So as you can see on the bottom in the middle, the letters D, downtown, RP, Research Park are the zoning districts. That's the distinction right now as to how much an in lieu fee is for. And there's differentiation based on zoning district and also based on if it's for sale or rental. We're proposing to modify it based on the type of unit that is required to be proposed, acknowledging that there's a significant difference in cost between a smaller unit and a larger unit. And also proposing a significant increase in the in lieu fee. And that calculation, as I mentioned before, is based on the difference between revenue from a market rate unit and an inclusionary housing unit over a 30-year period. Just on a high level, we looked at a variety of developments and their current pricing, the inclusionary housing current pricing, and made those calculations in order to come up with that data. And there's also one for 4-bedroom FYI, but the developments that have been in the program to date don't include any 4-bedrooms. So just for simplicity here, these are the ones that if the production stays the same would be relevant. And the reason that they're aligned with the reduced revenue and not reduced at all from that dollar amount because it incentivizes on-site units. It is a significant dollar amount, but based on the focus area, focus topics, and the added element of increasing production, this is a disincentive for developers to opt out and provide the in lieu fee. If the in lieu fee is provided, that would actually provide much closer to a dollar amount that could construct a unit or could go into other programs like we discussed earlier to address affordable housing from the Affordable Housing Fund. Yes. So for simplicity, if a development has 100 units and half of them are studio and half of them are one bedroom, then that would be the requirement for the affordable units, and the same thing for any other type of unit mix. And then once that is established, then the requirement, the 15% requirement, changes from a specific number of units, but a unit mix of units, and then we align it with that. Yeah. Okay. So continuing on as part of this suite of updates, the rental income limits in the program are currently 60% AMI. We're proposing to keep them at 60% AMI generally, but we're going to get to a couple exceptions. The main difference here is that it's weighted, and the weighted average does a couple things. One, currently, if there are 100 units in the development, 10 need to be affordable. All of them would be at 60% AMI. That's our program. If a developer is interested in something different, they have to submit an alternative equivalent proposal. It has to go to council for approval. It's a different process, and there actually is a lack of predictability there, even though there is flexibility. And so here we're building in the flexibility of averaging the units to 60% with a cap at 80%. So it can't, 100% wouldn't be eligible. So again, for simplicity, 5 units could be at 80% AMI and 5 units could be at 40% AMI. And part of that would help address reaching lower income families, lower income households, in addition to households at other AMIs that are higher than 60, capped at 80%. It also means that we're aligned with the Cook County housing tax incentives, which if a community puts this into the ordinance and requires it, that helps facilitate that tax incentive, which is definitely something that we'd like to support. The second one, the next couple, the next 3 actually, are basically conversions and pre-approved options that instead of having developers, like I said in the previous example, anything outside the bounds of 60% AMI and the way that our current ordinance is written, it's negotiated and it has to go to council for approval. There's a lot of question marks and lack of predictability. We're suggesting to build in 3 components, 2 components that are a little bit different for rental and for sale, that would spell that out and make that very clear so that a developer can opt for one of these options and move through the process more speedily and hopefully achieving the goals of our program. So the first one would be a developer could choose to reduce their requirement from 15% AMI to 12%, but then their weighted average is at 50%. So they're providing fewer units, but the units are capped at, are targeted at families with lower incomes, and they can go down to 10% at 40% AMI. So again, if the 10% option, there are fewer units, but the weighted average would have to be, instead of 80 and 40 from before, it would be 60 and 20. Or 50 and 30, they need to stay at 10%, or it gets very complicated to calculate. Those differences have also been checked against differences in costs for the developer, with an erring on the side of incentivizing this option because there was an interest to provide more for lower income families. And we don't want to make this punitive. We want to make it a little bit more beneficial. Similar for sale. For sale is 100% AMI, and we're looking to reduce the option to 12% and have it at 80% AMI. There's no requirement for weighted averages for the state, and we also don't want to go above 100% AMI, and we start at the top, so it's a little different situation. The last one of this group is the bedroom conversion, and it works in the same manner. So as Sue asked before, if a development, we'll go in a more complicated scenario. Development has studios, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, and 3 bedrooms. Most of the units are studios and 1s in typical developments, and fewer 2s and 3s. So the requirement would be aligned with that ratio, we would have a predetermined conversion table to incentivize the developer to say, oh, we have to provide 5 studios. Let's do the math and see if that actually adds up. Yep, that works. We can give 4 one-bedrooms instead. And that way we're getting a larger unit. And again, the rounding and the incentives are aligned based on current market conditions to hopefully be leaning towards a positive, not a punitive conversion. It obviously wouldn't work if the development doesn't have any 3-bedroom units. You couldn't convert to that. But this would be the setup there. Again, these are all incentivizing lower AMIs and more bedrooms and giving the developer more predictability and flexibility in this process. The last one is the on-site requirement. And this is a good example of where the whole suite works together. So currently there is no on-site requirement for sale units that can be bought off entirely with an in-lieu fee. And for rental units, it's if it's by right, they don't have to be provided. And if it's if a variance is required, half of them, 5%, are required on site, and half of them are not. Based on all the other layers projected, again, for flexibility, predictability, and because they're incentivized elsewhere, we're proposing that there is no on-site requirement because everything else incentivizes the building on site. And so just going back, even though that's the case, if a developer chooses not to, then their in-lieu fees would be between $405,000 and let's say $711,000 per unit for studios to 2 bedrooms. That's a lot of money that the city could use to put towards housing production, preservation, anti-displacement initiatives that have all been developed based on your recommendations for the strategic housing plan and are ready to go in short term. So that's sort of the suite where, again, the last piece I would say is, does that last piece of no on-site requirement doesn't make any sense without the other pieces. That seems like we're not getting what we're looking for. But altogether, based on our analysis, we're looking for your feedback that that's not a gap. That's just adding additional simplicity and giving flexibility. I wanted to provide a couple scenarios just to spell this out because it is sort of all in the weeds and in the clouds. So in this example, we're going to look at it twice. One with the current requirement and the second time with the proposed requirement to see what the differences are. So if you look in the right below development scenario, you can see that this development has 195 units and their current requirement requires 13 units. And in the box on the top right, just a little bit more detail. This is a downtown development. It's a rental units, and they're seeking a zoning a variance. And the unit mix is broken down below. So in terms of who's eligible for this property in these 13 units, all but 1 or 2 of the units are limited to 1 to 2 person households in our current setup. Again, we're leaving out the negotiated agreement with an alternative equivalent. Maximum incomes are 47 to 53,000, and minimum incomes to afford those rents aren't that much lower than that. So there's a small band for some people don't have enough income to qualify. Other people have too much income to qualify. And as you can see below, if half the units are provided on site, like we talked about in the last example, 50% are required. You can see the breakdown and the in-lieu fee that would be collected by the city and the Affordable Housing Fund. And then the second scenario where all are provided on site and the breakdown. And as you can see in the 2-bedroom, there's 1 or 2 units. Those are the exception to the majority of the units that would be limited as follows. So same scenario. Well, I'll go back for 1 second. Those are the 2 options. Theoretically, there's somewhere between 50% and 100% that can happen as well, but otherwise, those are the options. Here, there are 6 options I provided, and there's way more. This doesn't complicate the development at all. It just means the developer has more options. Staff may have to work on a few different variations, but if it leads to achieving the goals of the units, that's for a good cause. So same 195 units, same scenario. Now the requirement is 29.25. Last time it was 13. So that's a pretty big difference. The units now meet the housing needs of 1 to 4 person households with maximum incomes much more spread out, 15,000 to 80,000. And the rents are from under 400 to over 2,000. It doesn't mean every development will have all of that, of course, but there are options that the developer can choose. The way this would be set up, the city or staff wouldn't be pointing to this is what you need to do. It would be set up, these are the options. You can choose whatever you'd like. So we're not going to go through all of them, but if you look at the first one, where all the units are included, they round up and aren't providing an in-lieu fee. We're getting a lot more units, and we're getting 6 2-bedrooms. That's a lot more for larger households than that could fit in a studio or a 1-bedroom. If you go down to lower AMI, 3 from the bottom, there's fewer units than 30, but still 7 more units than currently. And there's the folks that are living there wouldn't be able to qualify in our current program. And the last one, if none are on site, we would receive $15.5 million to be used again in any of these scenarios. And the other one that wasn't an option, but even if it was, it would be double 1.4, it would be about $3 million. And then this is the other test that's similar to the other chart from the last presentation that we will not go over in great detail, but great. So there's a more detailed chart in the memo. All the columns don't fit on the slides, and it's still hard to read, I'm sure. But just want to walk you through the main components. So we looked at communities in the Chicago area and also nationally. We included Minneapolis was a specific recommendation by the committee. And so at least in this slide, we're looking at what are the requirements in each community, what are the AMIs that each community is working with, what's the rental and for sale in lieu fees, and then practically speaking, we're focusing on another example to compare because everyone's different in different scenarios. So we're looking at a 1-bedroom unit that's 650 square feet, 100 units downtown. That just sort of helps to understand each community's specifics and where we land. So all of that's put together there. As you can see, some in the Chicago area, it ranges from 5% to 20%. The AMIs vary, and oftentimes the AMIs, you can see a correlation between higher requirements and higher AMIs and vice versa. You can also see the 1-bedroom fees. A couple places don't apply in this scenario, and other ones are closer to where we were a long time ago. The order here is by how recently they've updated or passed their ordinance. I think that's listed in the packet. So Lake Forest was the earliest, and Skokie just approved theirs in the last year, I believe. At the bottom is our current and our proposed for comparison. And so it's the same thing for national. We have more, so there's a couple different slides. On a national level, you can see that the requirements are higher. The Chicago area tends to be a little bit lower other than Chicago and Evanston. But sometimes the AMIs are much higher, like in San Francisco or other high cost of living areas. And the in-lieu fees are also calculated differently. A lot of them are based on square footage, not based on unit, which is why we ended up going with a compromise scenario of doing it by unit size, a number of bedrooms, for studio, 1-bedroom, etc. Moving to that in this short period of time seemed like a big shift, but we're getting at sort of the same piece of it's more expensive for a developer or for a household to rent a 4-bedroom unit versus a studio. And one note is a lot of this is oversimplified. There are lots of caveats and exceptions and just rounded, and there's a lot of other zoning, permitting, environmental costs and pieces. So some of these may seem, this was my experience, was, oh, it doesn't seem that expensive here. And then you look, oh, in San Francisco, there are 100 other fees that aren't listed here. And that's adding to the cost. So I think this is very helpful, and there's a bit of grain of salt of, so how does that impact the overall cost of construction? It's hard to know without understanding the whole market dynamic and all those other pieces. But I think it's still helpful to identify best practices and where other communities are at. Again, these are in order of how recently they've updated them. So on the first page, these have updated pretty recently. And on the last page, a little bit longer ago. This is just one more comparison. If we go back to, this is on the left is the same chart we went over at the beginning, where we were looking at over the last 4 stages of the IHO. There were 131 unit equivalents. There are 94 units, but if we factor in the in lieu fee, and that was about 7.5% of the total units in those developments. Since we can't project the future, we're looking at the past with this same requirement. It would have yielded about twice as many units. Again, as you can see, our calculation is very simple. It's 15. We're not accounting for the 12 or 10% scenario, but that means we're getting more of what is currently recommended or yearned for in the ordinance versus incentivized and codified, which would lead to 263. Again, if these were required earlier, how would developers have reacted, et cetera? That we don't know, but I think this is a good way to compare the ordinance. So this one, I decided to lop off all the extra questions and stick to 3 specific ones. We're at a different stage, so I would love any and all feedback, but 3 that are particularly important are any focus topics that we discussed in June, and that we went over earlier. Are they not being adequately addressed, and therefore we're missing a piece here and need to adapt? Anything that needs to be strengthened? There's an exception. There's something that doesn't seem like it's going to get what we're looking for and needs to be tightened, or something that needs to be loosened or softened that seems too aggressive or something to that effect. Thank you in advance for your feedback.
Councilmember Harakaris, start.
Sure. I just want to start off and say thank you so much for putting this together. When we first discussed this, there's so many moving parts. I was like, oh, how are we going to get to where we need to be just based on everything we kind of wanted to have happen with this? One thing, that I had a small thought about and this is some feedback that I've heard from community members. There definitely seems to be a sentiment that affordable units should be affordable in perpetuity. Now, I know I've read things that have said, your new development, which, there's a lot of talk that, well, why are we building luxury developments, right? And so a luxury development in 2025, 30 years from now is going to be probably the affordable option for most folks, potentially. If you could speak to that a little bit. And also, is that the reason why we cap the affordability time at like 30 years? Because there is some thought that as the housing stock ages, what we look at as, the luxury is going to be the more affordable options. So if you can just speak to that for the public.
Sure. That was definitely something that we were looking at initially. It was on the radar. We were for sale units. They are affordable in perpetuity, and that was one thing that we put in as out of scope, not to reduce that. We're keeping that piece. Based on the sort of overall suite of changes, where the increase in the overall requirement goes up, the in lieu fees go up, et cetera. It seemed like a a particularly large ask to add the time frame increased as well. All of those are different ways of adding costs to the development. And so that was a sort of a balancing act. There's also the alignment with the Cook County incentives, which are also at either 30 years or 10 years renewable 2 times, equaling 30. That doesn't mean we can't require more, but there's an alignment there that's helpful in terms of marketing the program and talking about it with developers. But that is I don't know off the top of my head when the first developments are sunsetting after 30 years, but that will happen in the future. And that is a concern if we keep them at 30, I don't want to say in perpetuity, that's confusing for this situation, but forever. If we don't change that at some point, then they're going to be cycling out of the system.
Okay, thank you. So, I mean, I think that makes sense. I was personally pleased that the in lieu of fees seemed very substantial. And yeah, I think it also helped myself to see kind of the trends nationally and also the trends in the area that I think this looks like we would have probably the strongest inclusionary housing ordinance in the Chicagoland area by far. And then also kind of reiterate what Councilmember Burns said before. I've met folks who are in an inclusionary housing unit and new development, and it's an amazing situation for them. I think there sometimes is a sentiment that, well, we're only getting 10 units or it's only 15. It's not doing anything. And I just wanted to tell people that for those 10 or 15 people, that is incredibly impactful. And, the fact that we can, up those numbers from 10 or 15 to 20 or 30, I think makes a huge difference. And, this is one of many things we need to be doing to help the problem. So I'm really pleased with where we're at right now.
Great. Councilmember Burns.
First thing, Alex, you're going to have a long night trying to sift through all of this. So good luck. And hopefully Oreo make itself available to answer any clarifying questions through email, of course. I actually have to go, so I have 2 quick questions, but Ori, I'll be in touch. I'd love to just spend some more time with this. I was able to review it once, but there's a lot here. But again, excellent job on all of this. I think the first question, the first thing is just obviously we need at some point developer input. I'm not sure if that's already occurred, if that's planned, but one of the things that I think has been both useful and productive is on the Here to Stay committee that I'm a part of. We have a mix of affordable housing advocates, small to mid-sized developers, people with lived experiences, so who have experience being either displaced or who are currently housing insecure. And so I think it's important to get their input early on in the process. So again, maybe that's already happened, maybe it's planned, maybe you can speak to that briefly and then I can move on.
So the slide that covered, I'll bring that up again.
Perfect.
This is based on feedback from developers.
Perfect.
I don't remember off the top of my head, but a significant percentage of developers who participated in the program agreed to speak about ways to improve the program.
Okay.
That led to this component. A side note, there were also asset managers and attorneys who were involved also. Components of that aren't as relevant for the ordinance, but is able to pass that on to our team for improving the program after tenants are in or getting tenants into the units. We're more focused on the development side of the conversation. So that's where the focus of the feedback was here. So it wasn't, the conversation wasn't open-ended. There were set questions that they were answering, but it was not assuming anything specific would be happening, other than they were told that City Council has made a referral, a goal that we would increase. And so 10% and 20% the assumption was that was going up, and then they responded to, whatever up meant. They were able to say that that's too much, or that seems okay, or I'm concerned about smaller developers, et cetera.
And have they, there's a plan obviously for them to be able to react to this in that same manner?
We did many one-on-one conversations. I think it was 20 something for that process. We're not going to be able to replicate that now, but we will be able to reach back out to those contacts, especially those that participated previously, to get their feedback.
Okay, yeah, I think that's great. So is there an in lieu of fee if they decide to build offsite?
So offsite is an interesting one.
I thought I understood it, and then there was something in there. I'm like, all right, let me make sure I get it.
Currently, it's not included in the matrix that fit on the slides, but it's in the packet. Various communities treat offsite units in different ways. Some are basically equivalent to onsite. Other ones have different requirements. They're stricter. They have to be within a certain proximity. Basically, based on the suite that we're proposing, one for simplicity and predictability, and generally the odds of a developer having another property in mind, given the small amount of available property in Evanston, we leaned into the in lieu fee as a way to achieve offsite units. If the developer paid the in lieu fee, those could be used from the Affordable Housing Fund to construct offsite units. There's still the alternative equivalent there. We did not remove that because there is an understanding that there are just extenuating circumstances or creative ideas that we haven't thought of that we don't want to eliminate from the process. I believe the language in the ordinance includes offsite as one of the examples, but it's not limited. Anything is possible. The one thing we added to that process was there's a staff review that would assess the equivalency and determine if it's equivalent or more or under. And if it's under, it would not come with a staff recommendation, so that when it came to council, there would be a way to look at that and say, we're not getting an equivalent proposal here, or we're meeting or exceeding, and offsite units could be included in that proposal.
Okay, but if they meet the expectation of the goals, the standards, they no opt out, no in lieu of fee in addition to the offsite units, or
so assuming again, this is sort of like in the alternative equivalent scenario. So it's everything else is like very clear cut intentionally, and this is one area we've left open ended. So let's just say that there's 100 units. They're required to provide 15. They say they're providing 15 around the corner,
right?
And they're the same unit mix, and they're the same. They fit all the other requirements. Then staff should assess that, say that it's equivalent. It would go to council, and then council would need to add that extra layer of approval, but that should be allowable.
Okay.
But and council would have the opportunity in that situation to, though, say no. We want them on site, and that's that extra layer of ambiguity and unpredictability that could take place in that process.
And then last question is, how does this tie into the zoning change discussion we're also having? And I say that because there's one part of this where they could get, increase in, I don't know if we're doing all this, like density bonuses, floor area ratio. I don't know how deep we're going with that, but even if we just look at increased building height, if we're saying that in an area where we've also said we're going to do lower density, I'm just trying to understand how all of this, it feels like that has to tie into the zoning work that we're doing as well. So I'm just trying to understand how we're
Right.
how we're going to do that.
So given the Envision Evanston process, specifically the zoning code portion of that, that piece will be currently it's both in the zoning code and in the house in Title VI and the and that's confusing because it's duplicative, and so that doesn't need to be the case. And because there are incentives that will keep related to mainly waiving permit fees. We're going to keep that in this ordinance, but otherwise we would refer to the specific changes with density, whether it's parking, floor area ratio, density, et cetera, in the zoning code, which the land use committee will take up through this process. This committee will have an opportunity to review that and provide comment, because there is an understanding that if it's out of whack with what was expected, it doesn't seem like the incentives are lined up appropriately, and the general vision isn't moving forward. Part of that also is that this wouldn't go into effect until the zoning code goes into effect. So there isn't that in-between period of like the 2019 ordinance, the in-between stage, then the 2025 ordinance. We would only have two. I don't have specific dates when that will be available, but that will be part of the process, and an understanding that if there are significant changes in allowable heights or other components, that will need to be factored in to make the IHO achieve the goals that we're looking to achieve.
That's all, Chair. Thank you.
Okay. Chloe.
Thanks for all the detail. This was really helpful. More detail than I expected, and it turns out I needed all of that. So, I just had one really quick question about the shift from to revenue costs, and it sort of raises the incentive, creates more of an incentive to build these on site instead of paying. I'm just curious in terms of the other places that have adopted this. What is the evidence base that we have for sort of the effects on construction? Do we know how well it's worked?
Do you mean, has it succeeded in incentivizing on-site
exactly.
units?
Yeah.
Got it.
To what extent has it succeeded
So
in incentivizing
the
on-site
short answer
units?
is,
do we know? Can we know?
the short answer is we don't really know.
Okay.
A lot of these have been fairly recent, and even if they've been a little bit older, there hasn't been a ton of research on them. The best research seems to be a few years, or basically like a whole like cohort of these ordinances behind.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're more speaking to the best practices that are like old, basically, like one stage older.
Okay.
And so the short answer is
we can't know yet.
have
Okay.
much.
Thank you.
Joanne?
Yeah. So the developers have not seen this ordinance. You've just talked to them about components of what was going to go in it then.
Yeah,
Right.
the conversations were preliminary right around the time that we had our initial conversation in June and July. It's been posted, for this committee, so I don't know who's read it, but we haven't had like one-on-one conversations with the developers.
And so we've probably been told before, what size unit is in the most demand? Is it a 1-bedroom or a 2-bedroom for
Do you mean
people
for
needing housing?
Right. So that's tricky. I'll say one thing, and then I may. Liz is saying all of them, and I think that probably is the short. That probably is the short answer. Is all of them. The wait list only shows those people who have joined the wait list, and I would say are somewhat confident that the types of units that are produced are going to be on the wait list. So it skews towards smaller families and smaller units, but that's probably not representative of the need. It's just a practicality of getting on a list and staying on it when there's a chance that you'll qualify versus not.
And just one more thing. So the fees in lieu, there's no automatic adjustment reflecting increase, price index or anything. So anytime you would want to change these, that has to be a new ordinance?
No, that will continue. We currently have it go up with a specific consumer price index table that goes up every January. We would continue doing that. Instead of rerunning the survey and calculating the differences every year, we'll run that. And then the next time we need to, we provide a report and there's a need to look at the ordinance again, maybe that will be the appropriate time to do that.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Uri. You've done an amazing job for us and made, gotten I think a really good path forward so I think we're going to be comfortable with approval coming up at our next meeting.
Great. Thank you very much for your feedback.
Okay. Staff, quick staff update. Oh, right. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, there was one mother. Right.
I'm going to try to make it as quick as possible.
Okay.
The presentation should be much shorter. This is an update. I do plan on, because we've had a few meetings that were canceled, I do plan on coming back in October as well as in November, which is when we provide you the draft. So this is an initial update. Here? Okay. Okay, so just a quick reminder, this is, the key thing is this is a consolidated plan. So you've been talking previously with Ori about high level vision, 10 years, all the population. I'm talking to you right now about 5 years, grant funding, very specific population, extremely structured plan, maybe a slightly less exciting version of a plan. I have very structured question. There's not a lot of leeway to go outside of that. This is something that is a requirement, and there's specific questions we're trying to answer, although there is overlap. We do, as part of this process, we did get new low moderate income map. You may be familiar with those because we use them when we design programs. So just wanted to mention that we do have new maps. There's been some slight changes. And the census tract in yellow are the ones that are considered by HUD as majority low moderate income for Evanston. So as far as the consolidated plan, we have several sections. The sections that we are going to be discussing and drafting for you will include the housing stock, as well as non-housing community development efforts, public facilities, infrastructure, public service, broadband internet access, as well as environmental impact. We also include in the con plan past performance, citizen participation plan, which is a whole plan on its own that we have to review to make sure whether we need to make updates that drives how the residents and community members can interact and participate and provide comments, as well as general outreach process. And then we go into needs assessment and housing market analysis. That is where we probably have the most overlap, with the difference that we're looking very specifically at low moderate income households and how households with very specific needs, public housing supply, homeless population with special needs. So this is a lot more specific. And then after that, as part of the plan, we also include strategic plan and action plan. So the consolidated plan is composed of two sections. We have the 5-year planning, and then within this, we also have the annual action plan, which you are familiar with because we do that every year. Mm-hmm. So that will also be included as part of the draft you will see. And that starts including the allocation by goals that you're familiar with, the anticipated resources, and a whole host of sections that kind of speak to the consolidated plan, 5-year plan, and talk about what is going to be looked at and accomplished in the coming year. Things to note for this year, we're working from budget assumptions that include less funding. And that is a pretty significant difference from the last plan. We're projecting a 20% reduction in CDBG, so we're about $1.3 million. Projecting home to be at about $275,000. Again, those are numbers per year. And then no ESG. So really total, when you think about this plan and kind of what we're going to be able to do with it, we're really looking at about $1.6 million, when the previous plan included $2.3 million per year. There's significant reduction. We've talked about how this is fluctuating, but it's essentially what we're going to be working with. And we're going to talk about, there's a host of activity we can have with those funds, but we have to be very mindful of the multiplication of programs and the efficacy of our funds. $1 million essentially is not that much in the scale of the need and of what we're trying to accomplish. So as far as drafting the plan, we've been reviewing a host of plans from the city and from partners. We're looking at city manager's office plan, sustainability, equity, ADA transition plan, economic developments, putting assets to work may be particularly relevant, but also Evanston Thrives. We're looking at general community development plans that you are familiar with. But we're also looking at health and department E-plan, parks and recs, the community survey outreach they've done, public works, what capital improvement project they're doing, what kind of outreach they did on other items, as well as partners. So joining forces, the Equitable Zoning Project, Connection for the Homeless Strategic Plan, the Parents of Evanston Advocating for Change and Equity. They did a survey, community survey. There's some nice information we got from that. The key point around this is there's been a lot of work done, and the goal is to try to include all of that, those plans and all that outreach within what we're going to present to you, and to limit the multiplication of community engagement, essentially. So where that landed us, there's a host of other plans. I will post a presentation and you can review it with your time. We also have links to all those plans as well if you're interested, if you would like to review all of this documentation. We did do some survey, local survey, to specifically address key points that were strategically targeting the 0 to 80% AMI. A lot of this outreach was great and we got a lot of information, but it wasn't necessarily telling us what the population that's actually within that income range was saying they needed. And we wanted a little bit more detail around what they were looking for from us. So we start here to try to understand. I got a couple slides around CHAS data, is the data that we're required to use to be able to build this plan. So I just wanted to give you a quick highlight around who we're talking about when we're talking about the consolidated plan. So we've got about 28,000 households in Evanston. This data is a little older than the data that you would be discussing with Ori, simply because we are set by HUD to use specific data sets and they're just older. But generally speaking, so we're a little bit behind. Generally speaking, we're showing the same trends. We're just a few years behind, essentially. So we've got about 20,000 households. We got 26% of those that are 0 to 50% AMI. We have about 15% that are 50 to 80. We've seen since the last con plan a shift where we have less 0 to 30%, less 80 to 100%, but we have more in the middle, 30 to 80%. And we are seeing the same trend, although they were a little less strong, around increase in seniors and decrease in household with children under 6. Anna, can you help? Sorry. For some reason, it just doesn't. So we're talking about 11,000 households that are within those income in Evanston. And out of that, we've got about 64% of renters. So you're thinking about roughly 7,000 renters. Out of those, 70% are cost burdened. And we can see also here that we've got a very high percentage that are cost burdened, the lower income. Although you'll see that the 30 to 50% is actually the category of renters that's the most cost burden. And that's usually explained because the population that is in Evanston that's 0 to 30% and that rents may be accessing a voucher. And so there's a certain percentage that's doing better due to that. We have about 560 households in Evanston using a voucher. So put that in relation to 7 households that are renter in our income range and 70% that are cost burden. That's 5,000 households, essentially. So a high need. Homeowners are showing about 4,000. They're showing about the same range of cost burden. What is interesting, there's a smaller percentage, and we're seeing the larger chunk of homeowners around 50 to 80% income, which is not very surprising. But we are seeing that in the low range of income, the ones that are homeowners are seeing a higher cost burden. They're struggling a little bit more than the renters. As far as the local survey that we did a very targeted outreach. This was not a broad survey. We went to local partners that worked with population that was in the targeted income range, and we went to work with advocates that worked specifically to outreach in person with paper surveys with people that were in this income range as well. We got about 275 response. We did it in Spanish and in English, online and on paper. And we really focused on very key questions. We had 4 sections, and essentially the goal was to ask them the minimum amount of information while still being useful, and specifically asking around the kind of programs that federal funding can provide. So housing, public facilities, public services, economic development, to try to understand kind of what was critical for them. We did have opportunity for open comments as well in case we had forgotten anything. Out of our response, we had about 80% that could be classified as low mod income. We were very happy to see that people were comfortable sharing their income. That was a worry, and they did share that information. And out of the renters that responded, pretty much 100%, because we have about 9% that did not provide income, over 90% were low mod. So we have a good mix as far as targeting the right population. High level, we got 72% that did not think the availability of housing in Evanston met their needs for renters. We did see, similar to the comment that was made about ADJOUR unit, we did do some on-site survey at the Hack building, Housing Authority of Cook County. All the residents that responded were satisfied with the availability of housing, which kind of goes in line with the fact that maybe ADJOUR units, different type of units, but the kind of units where you're able to get affordable housing. Once you get it, you're happier with the availability. About 80 to 85% considered rent assistance critical or important, and pretty much all housing program were considered important by the majority of respondents. So we ended up looking at what was considered less important to actually get something valuable here. What was shown as not at all or less important was essentially down payment assistance, homeownership assistance, as well as homeless shelter services. That was the top 3 category essentially as far as housing programs. For public services, this is less relevant to this committee. This is specifically for social services committee, so I'm going to skip this slide, but you will be able to review it. It'll be posted online and by email. And then we were requested to provide an overview of CDBG program and what can be done with the funding, so you have an understanding of that for the next discussion. So I'm going to try to be as high level as possible. Essentially, when it comes to CDBG, there's programs that we've been doing already. So public facilities improvement, this is your alley paving, sidewalks, but it's also nonprofit buildings that are being rehabbed. We have public services, which is capped at 15% max of CDBG. So we're really talking only about $200,000 per year. And that would be for new services or quantifiable increase in services. This includes a variety of safety net or case management services, but could also potentially include emergency rental assistance up to 3 months. We have housing rehabilitation that you're familiar with, as well as homeownership assistance that could be possible. New on something we haven't necessarily done a lot of is acquisition of real property. So we can't do new construction with CDBG, but we could, as an example, use CDBG to purchase an apartment building to provide rental units to a majority of low moderate income household at an affordable rate. We could also have a very long-term lease, at least 15 years. For economic development, there's two options. The majority of what we've done has been micro-enterprise grants. You're familiar with that. You approved a project in July. There's also some special economic development activities. That is a little bit more challenging to do in Evanston, but that is usually and comes with a lot of limitation. We're talking about job training for low moderate income people or business that serves low moderate income customers. And there's a host of rules that have made this option more challenging as far as the use of CDBG. It's possible, but not always practical for Evanston. There's code enforcement, which you're familiar with, as well as housing services. So that could be housing counseling, energy audit, tenant selection, etc. And that's kind of in line with the same rules as the home program. And then capacity building, which we're not currently doing, would be external services for community development planning, and it would count towards our 20% admin cap, which we're already currently at the max. There's a host of other things on this slide that we could do, but doesn't really totally apply to Evanston. And then there's a couple things that we were asked to discuss. So there are certain flexibility in certain programs that we can do if we leverage a community-based development organization. This is a very specific type of organization that would have to be organized under state or local law. It has to be operating primarily in Evanston and be very much dedicated to community development in Evanston. So very kind of specific organization. That does open some additional opportunity for CDBG program or sometimes soften the rules. There's a potential as well of, depending on whether the organization is well established or newer, or kind of its level of activity, of potential increased risk here. So there's positive and negative around this approach. There's the list of the program that it kind of opens up. There's neighborhood revitalization to kind of impact the decline of a designated geographic location. So if there's an area or neighborhood that's in decline. There's community economic development, and that does include housing if it's specifically for workers that can't currently find housing in Evanston, and energy conservation. And then finally, there is the potential of Section 108 loans. That's not something we as a city have done, at least not recently, and not that I'm aware of. And that's essentially leveraging our CDBG grant allocation to secure flexible, lower interest loans for very specific projects. That could include a host of options, but potentially housing and housing rehab. We could get about 5 times our annual allocation as a loan from HUD as a maximum. We have to use the grant allocation to secure the loan, but we also have to fund projects that would be able to cash flow. So that is something we can look into, but that might be a little bit complex if we're talking about affordable housing and high percent, because they still have to meet the regular CDBG rules, including the 51% of low mod income household in the building. But that is an option, and there's specific eligible activities under those loans. Next steps here is for me to come back in October and to start talking about all of the other funding that is existing within the city of Evanston, programs that are existing that are kind of overlapping with what we're discussing and trying to do here. The biggest challenge here is making sure that we're using CDBG to, again, not a huge amount of dollar, in a way that makes sense and not in a vacuum. So we're not saying, okay, there's a need for XYZ, let's do this, when there might be other programs using different funds that would be better suited and more flexible. So it's trying to find the right balance here as far as what we're trying to do as a whole and how we should use the grant funding. So I'll come with some information about other funding that are existing in other programs, like guaranteed basic income, some of the rental assistance program that are existing, and where we may want to kind of have direction. And then I'll also discuss kind of with the reduction in funding, we also have to be mindful of not having a multiplication of programs where we're essentially splitting funds in such small envelope that our admin costs are really high, but our impact can be reduced. And we'll also talk about risk management and kind of the risk of making very, very large changes in how we approach our funding as far as grant management. So that's kind of the next step. Any questions?
Councilmember Harris, go ahead.
Marion, thank you for your work on this. I think I know it was disappointing when we heard that we were getting less money this year, but looking forward to see what ideas we have. I would personally think, even though there's more kind of outside the box options, I think given less money, we might want to stick with what we've done in the past, but looking forward to hearing what all the opportunities are. So.
Okay, thank you.
Agreed. Okay, so we'll look forward to the next round of discussion then on that. And
Sounds
then
good.
You have any other staff update?
Staff update quickly. We got our grant for FY24. That was probably the latest we've ever gotten them. That has no impact on projects and activity, just impact on staff trying to meet the deadlines. The Congress appropriation, they're trying to vote a continuing resolution. We don't think it's necessarily going to be passed. We're hoping there's not going to be a shutdown. The shutdown shouldn't necessarily impact us, but it does kind of, the progress they're making impacts our ability to make projection as far as what we think we should expect and how to do this 5-year plan without an idea on where they're going with policy. And then we don't have any news for urban shelter, but we should have that in the next week or two at the latest. Sorry, urban shelter is the urban shelter CDBG CV application that we put into the state back in June for funding for rehab of a homeless shelter in collaboration with Connection.
Right. Okay, great. Yes.
I just want to steal the mic for a second to give kudos to my team. They're amazing.
I
I just
agree.
really, they've been working really, really hard. They were very, very excited to give this update. I know we had a couple of meetings that we weren't able to make just based on quorum. So I just want to give kudos to my team and really just thank them for their work and commitment to this. So thank you.
Yeah, no, it's been an amazing evening, so thank you all very much. Yeah. With that, I'm going to, our next meeting is October 15th, I think. Anyway, for continued discussion about all these important issues, and I declare us adjourned.